can't take it on, there might be other approaches for it. But I don't want to look at tiny little silos, because what recycling committee is doing is already going to cause impacts at the local level, and to ignore certain items that also sit on top of the garbage can or the recycling bin, depending on how a local program does it, is going to get touched on it. You can't just ignore it. So I support Heidi, Chair Sanborn and Vice Chair Valle taking this on.
Thank you. And Commissioner Valle?
No, I agree with what Commissioner Snyder just said. The chair and vice chair will take on the issue. We're not pushing it to a committee, just for clarification. I don't think we said that.
Okay, thank you. And Commissioner Lapis?
Yeah, I was going to agree with most of what Ann said. I just want to add that, I mean, one of the reasons why I think it might seem like an oddball specific issue, but there will be legislation on it one way or another. And so I think the legislature is looking for recommendations on it. And I've heard from multiple MRF operators that is their single biggest, curbside MRF operators, that is their single biggest issue, is improperly, disposed of batteries. And so it is an oddball, but I think it's timely and urgent.
Yeah, and it's increasing the cost too. So I think the chair and vice chair will look at this and come up with a proposal on how to deal with it that you can all give us feedback on and decide on at the next commission meeting, okay? Unless somebody's opposed to that still, okay. And then the other comments that Dr. Levinson actually submitted were regarding, one is regarding the Clean Air Act and consolidated permitting. And I think I'd mentioned Commissioner Potashner was on the Market Development Committee meeting, and is that okay to throw that comment to you and your organics? Great, thumbs up, thank you. And then the other two are regarding GoBiz and the general plan guidelines. Those have already been taken up really in Market Development Committee, so I propose they stay there with Commissioner Davis. Assuming you're okay with that. And then I'd also suggest that we have a data request of Cal Recycle based on these comments, because what Howard was saying was that Kara Morgan and I worked with OPR several years ago to modify the general plan guidelines and incorporate much of what is now there in regards to recycling. You might want to contact her and get more information on that interaction. So is it okay if we ask Cal Recycle to just report back to us on the general plan guidelines if there's anything that's been done on those that's directly related to what the Market Development Committee has been asking? Or Commissioner Davis, is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll make a contact and start working on it.
Great. So then we have reviewed all of those comments, and the last, I think we've gotten through them all. Unless there's any other public comments, Cal Recycle?
No other comments at this time.
Great, thank you. All right, so now we're on to agenda item number 4. We're running a little behind now, but that was an important discussion. And this is about the report recommendations and process. I first want to say thank you to Commissioner Ward. Unbeknownst to you, most of the public probably listening, he was literally attacked at work at the transfer station and ended up in the hospital a couple of weeks ago, and was literally calling me from the hospital because he is so committed to this report and this commission. So I just wanted to say I'm glad you're healing well, Commissioner Ward, and thank you for your dedication and hard work in helping with this report. I couldn't do it without you, and neither could the commission. So I'll turn it over to Ted to give you an update on where we have left the report, which is posted on the Google document.
Sure. I guess we'll start with the report. We'll start with this since you brought that up, Kate. Thanks so much. So this is something that's in the Google Docs folder on the main commission report, and essentially it's a format for policy proposals. If you haven't already structured your policy proposal and you're looking how to do it, this is here to give you a little guidance. Start out with which committees it's coming from, the policy title, the date before the committee, the date before the commissions, the primary authors. That's all sort of housekeeping. Status, initial concept versus final proposal, which we reviewed the last meeting. Background, giving the context for the policy suggestion, including references to statute or regulation. This section might also reference reports or historical trends or implementation issues. Purpose, what concern is actually being addressed? What are the intended results of the policy? Clarifying whether or not the proposal would require legislation or an interaction with an agency other than CalRecycle, since most of these advisory bits, if they don't require legislation, are probably going to be advised to CalRecycle. Is there any other agency that has overlap? Some of the permitting guidelines, for example, certainly would. Is this a very important question leading up to January 21 is this a possible 2021 legislative priority, and explanation on that? And then finally, does this proposal require any additional funding or changes to resource allocation? So with all of those questions outlined, pretty much then you lead into the proposal being as specific as possible, referencing code sections or definitions or performance standards, which agency or entity does what, how is that reported or observed, how is it overseen, by when, over what time frame, and then any other related issues. Does this relate to any other policy programs or any other existing program? And then we're asking that each of the chairs and somebody else from the committee be responsible for uploading to each of the Google Docs committee folders. And I've created a special folder in each of those for policy proposals that are ready to be uploaded into the document. Just to be clear, there's a lot of the committees are setting up separate folders for each meeting, which is really helpful to everybody. But then I want to make sure that I'm uploading the right version of the right policy, because these are continuing to be tweaked. So once they get uploaded, then I think the better thing to do is just to edit the main document rather than to try to continue to do the upload process. So that's more or less the structure of the policy proposals. They haven't all followed that, and I don't think we need to revise the ones that have been put out there, but those committees might look at the policy proposals you put forward and then look at these questions and see if there's anything you might want to add. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I would just reiterate. Yeah, I just want to reiterate too that some of the initial proposals that came to us were just basically, very detailed proposals, but in a PowerPoint format. And before our last meeting, we did approve the process of we have to get something in writing from committees, whether it's following this and we can discuss this format or not, to put into the report. So Ted and I are not interpreting the work of the committee or the commission. It's got to be the commission approves actual language. And then Commissioner Davis, I think you had a comment.
Yeah, Mr. Lapis may have been before me. If not, I have a question. Ted, on the you're asking the dates that the item, I guess, was discussed at the committee. It seems, I'm just curious about the utility of that. A lot of these are discussed at every committee meeting, and I'm not sure what the utility of that question is. Maybe it's it seems to me more important, when did the committee adopt the recommendation and forward it to the commission? So
yeah,
that would be one suggestion.
The only utility of that is being able to look back at the meeting minutes or details of the meeting to see how the policy progressed, but it's really not that important. I agree. The most important thing is when does it move forward. Yeah, when did it clear the committee? Mm-hmm. Right.
The date the committee adopted it.
Yeah, and I think the chair clarified my question, because we did have a recommendation on the state agency by Recycle that I think moved to tentative adoption last time, but it wasn't in this format. So hopefully we don't have to delay moving that forward and put it in this format at this point. So, thank you.
Great. Okay, there's no other comments on that. We can move on maybe to the report, huh?
So thanks for bringing that up. The main thing on the report, I've dropped in the policies that were discussed previously, and I've added in where the table of contents would be are hot links to each of the sections. So if you click on any of those hot links, then you'll be taken immediately to that section. Of course, the value of the table of contents is it starts to give you a structure of how the document's assembled and what's covered under which section. And it's pretty clear to me that it could use some restructuring already. I think the outline format is probably getting in the way more than it's clarifying things. But I think that we've got a good beginning, and we can see where each of your policy recommendations are going and the status of those. So for instance, the recommendations on improving organics management, there's the precautionary principle is there. You can just click on that and it'll take you straight to that proposal. So hopefully this will make the document a lot more user-friendly to be able to review and see what the status is of which section. And I'd be happy to take feedback on this. In addition to the acknowledgement that I do believe it needs to be restructured for clarity.
We're just trying to start to outline in the index, make it super clear what it was that was in the report, and that might make it easier for you as well to see, do you want to move things around? Where do you think things should go? And really, Ted and I are going to work very hard over the next several meetings to get this very, very buttoned up, because we literally only have 3 more meetings after today to basically approve the final to go January 1st, unless we schedule another meeting. So we're kind of running out of time.
One suggestion I'd really like to sort of get buy-off on the group for, if it's okay, is if we could scroll down. Essentially, I think source reduction should be its own section. We've got specific issues under law regarding strategies to on food rescue, but the others are not as specific in terms of what the commission needs to come out. And I think it would be helpful to give an overview about source reduction and then apply it to organics and non-organic. And I'd be happy to work with Commissioner Schneider on that and Commissioner Sanborn in terms of structure. General consensus? Not seeing opposition? Okay. Please, if you could cover cycle, make sure that gets reflected.
Okay. Did you want to go through any other sections of the report? Like where we put the market development recommendations?
Sure. If you just scroll up to the top, but yeah, you can. Kate, I think you're the one who's.
Yeah, and Ted, I don't think I can use those hot links when I'm in view only.
Understood. Okay, so but if you scroll up to the top, I'll just try to mouse with my words. You can scroll up to the top of the table of contents, please. There you go. So you'll see that essentially we give the background, the origins. Getting there from here, we might want to retitle that. It's still kind of clunky. But essentially, we've set an ambitious goal that we're not meeting currently. And how do we get there? So then we start with market development committee recommendations. And I think it probably makes more sense to just talk about these market development recommendations, source reduction recommendations, recycling recommendations, and labeling recommendations. Just make it consistent but those 4 categories are what is required under law. And if you click on those hot links, you'll see items number 1 and 2. We already have draft documents from the Market Development Commission. And so you click on it and then you get that hot link beneath, and then you click on that hot link and then it'll take you to that section of the document. Thank you, Kate. That's exactly how it works. So you then go to number 1 and you can see the language under there. I think that language could still be improved, but that really comes from each committee, and it's up to each committee regarding that language. I just as sort of an editorial attitude, I will try to only make edits for clarity when they're necessary. In general, it's up to the committees to bring forward the language. But that's how it works. You click on the hot link, you get the little thing underneath, you click on that, and it takes you to that section of the document. So the table of contents, if we can go back up to the top, really does give you an idea of the structure of the document. And if your committee thinks that it needs to be restructured, then make those suggestions. But that's market development. Then you've got source reduction, scrolling down. Again, I think that needs to be restructured a little bit. Item number 2, there is the one thing required under law currently, for the report. Scrolling down. Yeah, so then you've got the recycling recommendations, and those were the items that the recycling committee had identified. And that matrix is really great, and I think we could incorporate that into text, but we need to be strategic about how to do that, because it's a long list. Then you've got recommendations from the organics committee that aren't source reduction items. And then you've got the recommendations from the labeling and media committee.
Commissioner Lapis and I think Commissioner Schneider had comments.
Okay.
I'm wondering logistically, do you want us to be making edits in suggestion mode?
I think that's I think that's a great idea, and because the whole utility of having these documents is being able to weigh in right on the text, and then having everybody see those comments. So I think that's a really good idea.
And do you have any deadlines you want to give us for commenting on this draft, or is it just kind of work in progress?
I think work in progress. I think if you put the comments in, then we can try to address them between the meetings and everybody can see the draft text. Chair Sanborn, do you have more on that?
Well, I would think, if you could take a look at, we're getting to the point where we're many, many pages in, and I'm getting worried if we put all the comments off to the end with 17 commissioners, it could be really hard for us to figure out how to wrap this up by mid-December. So if you do have comments on where we are to date, it'd be very helpful if you get us comments at least 3 days prior to the next commission meeting, so we can have this. We have time to digest it all and figure it out, and then give you another proposal outline.
Okay, so scrolling down, so this is the media committee, and then finally you have the sort of wrap up things, how they work together, the updates or the recommendations that won't be in the first report, and then the additional needs for research, information, analysis. So that's the current outline structure, and you can see where your pieces fit in, and we'll continue to, it is intended to be a dynamic process where you can see where the draft stands and make suggestions about how to make it better.
Commissioner Schneider had her hand up.
Well, now that I've got one thing off my to-do list so that I can concentrate on source reduction, I'm just trying to figure out if all of us are also going to be talking about funding mechanisms. Materials in curbside have a funding mechanism. Materials under CRV have a funding mechanism, but a lot of source reduction does not. And they have to, the thrift stores, for example, have to operate entirely on their own. They pick up bulky goods versus bulky good collection by residential programs. So Commissioner Ward, I'm hoping that when you and I work on that, we might also look at funding mechanisms, and it may play out in other committee areas too. As you push things off of curbside, where are they going to go? We expect buybacks to come in, and yet many buybacks are expected to stand on their own or survive only on CRV, and they're not. So I'm just playing around in my head with funding mechanisms.
I would suggest that no policy should be recommended that does not have a funding mechanism. Nothing is going to happen unless it's funded. If there's anything we've learned over the last 20 years, it's follow the money. So I think we all have to, be very careful about recommending anything that isn't funded. For example, trying to hit 75% when we all knew that was going to be extremely difficult. But the bottom line is it comes down to money. There's not enough money out there to fund the infrastructure we need to meet that goal yet. And that's part of what I think we're charged with. So, and okay. Commissioner Davis, I'm sorry, did you have something else to say?
I was only going to add that to me, I think that helps when we consider all of the businesses we're talking about as essential businesses, and society needs to reflect that in how they fund them. So are the Goodwills, the St. Vincent de Paul's, are they important enough in the recycling world or zero waste world to get some kind of, to be truly part of the system, not just, oh, you do it and you do it for free for us.
Yeah, that could be a recommendation for sure. And I know they got hit pretty hard with COVID too. Commissioner Davis?
Yeah, it's a concern I have often trying to use Google Docs. That it's hard to, you look at something and a couple hours later it's different. How frequently do you need to go back to look? My concern, Ted, is for example, in the market development, you picked up the language that we brought forward. Much of that language came back. we took it back to the committee, modified to incorporate comments from the commission, and now the committee is doing a further dive on some of those items. And so you've got things in here that really came back to the committee. The item number 2 on increasing demand for recycled content products, that one, I think there was pretty clear consensus to move that forward. But the other items really are still working their way back through the committee. So I don't know how to handle that. It came up, it bounced back, it'll come back again. It seems like moving an item from that initial presentation at the committee to the subsequent adoption stage is the point where it belongs in the document. And so again, it's just not clear how we're treating what really are still tentative recommendations from committees, putting them in this document and opening them up further comment. We're going to be chasing our tail for a while. So.
John, maybe there was a mistake then, because my understanding at the last commission meeting was we approved the slate of market development proposals, and particularly like state agency buy recycled, we removed the one on life cycle, but everything else everybody discussed was okay to go into the report as the first reading.
On the buy recycle.
Yeah.
Was my understanding. It was so the buy recycle is in here, but there's also the consolidated permit, the go biz, all of those.
Yeah, that wasn't ready to go in there.
I see. Okay.
But they're here in the report. Yeah.
Sorry, John, I didn't catch that. Yeah.
And I think probably the most straightforward way to deal with this is just as you did, which is take a look at the document, and if there's anything that seems out of place, or if I've got the wrong version, then we'll work together to make it right. Happy to do that.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to understand the intent, whether it's everything that comes to the committee ends up in the draft report, or only what the commission moves forward moves into the draft report.
Only what the commission specifically approves to go in. And I thought we were going to just do a red line. So it was new and saying, basically, this is it, guys. This is the new thing that we did in first reading. And we're going to have to do a second reading if we're going to approve this section, which raises a process question. So while we're going through this report right now, would we approve second reading of things? Or would we wait till we go back to committee reports and have those sections done? Because that might be hard to go back and forth. I'm just thinking process-wise going forward. On this particular item is a great example, state agency buy recycled campaign, because I don't think we noticed it that way. We were just talking about report recommendation. Well, actually, it's discussion of report recommendations and process.
So what I had set up is that when it gets approved at the full commission, I drop in red text into the document, and that's what you see. All the new stuff is in red from the committees. If there's any comments or additional things that Heidi and I have, that's in green. And once it's gone through the red text version and everybody's fine with it, then it goes to black. And so then you've got the black text that's been through at least 2 opportunities for the commission to comment on it. And then it moves forward. It's still available for comment and editing up until final approval, but it goes initial red, then to black, then it's additional comments as needed.
Right. So on the second reading, would we do it at this point on the agenda, or would we do it under commission or committee reports?
I think under committee reports, just specifically, just like John's doing, he's identifying, no, that what's in the report right now needs to be fixed. We all acknowledge that.
Okay, great. Then that's what we'll do going forward. So John, when things come up at your committee report and you want it to go for a second reading, that's when we would look at adopting those for the second time in the report. And if they're wrong, that's the time we should clean them up in this section.
Okay, got it.
Great. So definitely let Ted know what got into the report that shouldn't have. And we'll be very careful when we approve stuff. Be very clear, Ted and I, about what exactly, because I understood it to just be say, and I didn't. I've been trying to get all the comments and everything, so I missed that. I think there's some public comments. Would you like to hear from the public? Okay, so Laura, do you want to read off the comment?
Yes, so we have two comments. One that came in late. Oh, can you hear me? Perfect. Okay, so we have two comments. One that came in late from the last agenda item from Howard Levinson, and it says, I appreciate the Commission's discussion about household hazardous waste /CEW. Regardless of how this is handled, my primary intent in the comment about modulated fees was to let the Commission know that CalRecycle has done background work on modulated fees should the Commission wish to recommend modulated fees as a policy option to promote reuse and repair. And the second comment is from Tim Shestek from the American Chemistry Council, and it says, can the Commission clarify its intent on what it intends to complete by the end of the year versus the July 2021 deadline? There have been comments about only 3 meetings left to go to get this report done. Thank you.
I can, because this is about the report, I can respond to Tim Shestek's comments. And basically, the Commission at every meeting, we were always rebalancing our priorities and how much work the committees have gotten done and what's in the report. And we're going to discuss that again today, actually under the agenda item around chemical recycling, because we had discussed that we want the low-hanging fruit, the stuff that we could easily, relatively easily agree and get consensus around, that we want to make sure that gets to the legislature at the beginning of the session. Now, how far we get is up to how much work gets done. I don't think, is there anybody here that wants to predict how much we're actually going to get into that first report? Because I certainly wouldn't want to forecast that at this point, but maybe somebody else does. I think we're just working as hard as we can and going as fast as we can with the volunteer commission, and we'll do what we can. But we can't, we don't want to move things before they're ready either. Okay, unless anybody else wants to say anything to that. Okay, Ted, are we done with the report then, or anything else? Again, thank you so much for your work on this, Ted, and you and I should probably schedule some long chunks of time to really dig into this. So thank you very much. And other commissioners, if you could please take a good look at this and give us any feedback, and John, definitely about your section very quickly so we don't have stuff hanging out there that isn't ready yet. Okay, so we'll move on now. It's 9:30, so we are behind our agenda timing by 15 minutes, but this has been a great discussion. We'll move into the discussion on the Basel Action Network presentation. I want to thank Commissioner Valle for inviting Jim Phuket. I thought it was extremely informative. I think all of you did too. We had a great discussion, but it was more limited than we had hoped because of time. Time seems to be our enemy, our most limited, valuable, precious commodity. So with that, I'll turn it over to Vice Chair Valle to discuss the proposal that is posted in the Google documents. And I was going to work with him on this. I actually didn't have the time, and he worked with, I delegated that to Commissioner Valle to pick, and he picked Mr. Lapis to go ahead and work with him on this. So go ahead and turn it over to you, Commissioner Valle.
Thank you, Chair Sanborn. And I appreciate the help from Commissioner Lapis, who helped put together the presentation. And I don't know if we can do screen share. Commissioner Lapis, do you know if we can get our recommendations on the screen?
I have it ready. Yeah,
okay.
If you'd like me to share that.
Super. I'm going to walk you through some brief introductory remarks. we had a meeting with Jim Puckett, the executive director of the Basal Action Network. And I'll just do some of the highlights from this introduction. As we heard, California is the leader in the export of plastics, mixed plastics throughout the nation. And so if there's anyone that sends mixed contaminated bales of plastic and paper mixed with plastic, it's usually out of the West Coast. And we're going to Asian facilities throughout the Pacific Rim. And as Jim said, the reason this came up in the first place was because AB 1583 talks about products that are recyclable and products that are in curbside recycling programs. So the general public's perception is that everything I put in my cart is going to get recycled. We know from experience that that's not true. Hence the creation of this statewide commission. And that's why we were asked to look at these issues. So Jim's work since the early 90s has revealed a lot of gaps in our system. Primarily that there are substandard processing methods used throughout Southeast Asia that have considerable impacts, not just on the people, the waterways, the environment, but subsequently will have long-term effects on the overall global environment based on what they're doing with that material, much of which doesn't get recycled at all. Some countries such as Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia have now started sending back contaminated mixed plastic scrap containing scrap plastics and other materials that contaminate their loads back to the countries of origin. So the Basel Convention talks about what we need to do to clean up what we export. What they've done is their recommendations are based on very important elements. One, the United States Constitution's Commerce Clause, the California Unfair Business Statute, as well as the Basel Convention's new trade rules that could be applicable to California if the United States was a member of the Basel Convention, which it is not. The United States is the only developed country in the world that is not a member and signature to the Basel Convention. So these recommendations call for an end to diversion credits for recycling overseas unless the recycling can be demonstrated to be lawful and relevant to recycling throughout the globe. Commissioner Lapis is going to walk us through 4 recommendations that I think would fit perfectly into what Commissioner Ward described in terms of our policy recommendations. And we tried to keep them as simple as possible, knowing that the state legislature has the potential to pass these on, but also is handicapped because the United States is not a member of the Basel Convention, but California has set the trend time and again when it comes to conserving energy and creating opportunities to get away from fossil fuels, which we all know impacts our environment. So again, a lot of thought and a lot of consideration, but remember that the work that the Basel Convention group has been doing is 2 decades worth of work. And so they've done a very thoughtful job of looking at these issues. And I think it's in our best interest to look at them in the interest of keeping the planet safe, but also being respectful of people, knowing that their perception is everything is recyclable. Commissioner Lapis.
Yeah, I'll go through the specific recommendations. Kate, if you could scroll down. So the first one is basically what Jim suggested during his presentation, which is not speaking to regulating trade, but saying that you're not allowed to do anything in violation of the jurisdiction to which you're sending your material. It's agnostic on the what that actually means, the specifics, but it's a way to codify the convention in California law and allow prosecution under California law without explicitly violating interstate commerce or limitations on trade. It's a little legally complicated, but that's, I mean, the gist of it. The second item on the list is transparency on where material is going. We do have some, new reporting under AB 901 and the RDRS system of where folks are sending recyclables, but it's aggregated to a point that isn't necessarily useful for figuring out if an individual company is violating another country's laws, or for a resident to know what's happening to their material. And so the recommendation here is that, well, first of all, there are kind of two recommendations here. One is that we disclose much more of what's happening, the specific facilities where material is going, even if it's going through a broker. So publish more of that data. And the second one is if CalRecycle, who has access to more data than we do as the public, sees information that indicates that material is going somewhere in violation of the Basel Convention, they will notify the recycling facilities and the local governments, basically let them know, hey, just so you know, your broker might be violating the law, FYI. And I think that would discourage a lot of the violations in and of itself. Number 3 is the one that Eric mentioned at the last meeting. Eliminate diversion credit for mixed plastics export. Basically, if you're sending material overseas and it's going in a mixed bale, we have no evidence that that's actually, especially plastic materials, we have no evidence that's actually being recycled, so we should not count it towards a jurisdiction's diversion accounting. We technically don't have diversion accounting anymore. We switched to something called the per capita disposal reduction targets. So that's why that wording is the way it is.
Sorry, excuse me for interrupting, but there's a couple of our commissioners that have comments, and I'm not sure if you want to maybe go through one recommendation at a time and take comments.
Well, let me just finish the last one, and then we'll open it up.
Okay.
And then the last one is that the California legislature should adopt a resolution supporting the U.S. joining the Basel Convention, and if adopted, they should direct their lobbyists and advocates at the federal level to push for it. And those are the 4 recommendations.
Ellen and Commissioner Potashner both had comments.
Heidi,
Heidi, we
that
can't
was
hear
very
you.
low if you could repeat.
Oh, Commissioner Dell?
Oh, great. I couldn't hear you. Thank you for this. As an engineer who has worked in all of these countries that are receiving our waste for 20 years, and I've been working to try to stop plastic pollution via exports for more than 2 years and tracking this data, I strongly support these recommendations as being legal and ethical, and to help California residents, consumers understand where their plastic waste is going. I would like to point out, I actually made a request from CalRecycle to advise us on a legal question. And I made that request in more than a month ago in the last label meeting. And what I'd like to know is actually what the law is for cities and MRFs on creating acceptance lists. Do they need to know that there's actually a market for what they're saying is recyclable to consumers? Or is it false advertising if they say, yes, you can, we've got this on your acceptance list, you can put it in a bin, it's recyclable. Well, if no market exists for it, Is that false advertising? Is that legal for them to be doing? Because I think this really ties into what we're getting at here of what is there an end market? Is it a legitimate end market? And consumers need to know and be told the truth on whether something's recyclable. And I'd just like to put that request back out to Cal Recycle again, because I made that request more than a month ago and we haven't heard back on the legality for both cities and MRFs of stating something is recyclable and telling consumers to put it in their bin. Another aspect to this is if it's not recyclable, then the city / MRF has just told someone to create contamination, which drives up rates. So I commend and support these recommendations and think this is just a broad area we need to go to in full transparency.
I'd like to follow up with that with Cal Recycle. Have you received that request, and where are we in getting an answer to Commissioner Dell's question, which seems pretty valid?
This is Laura Moreno, and apologies, the request is in process, and we will prioritize it to get you a response back. But we did note that at the last Labeling and Media Committee as a data request in addition to one other one from Commissioner Dell.
That could be in the early recommendations about, whether that is formalized, if that isn't already in law, because I think that's a good point. If you advertise it as recyclable and accept it in the recycling bin, then it ends up being contamination if it doesn't have a market. Commissioner Potashner?
Yeah, a couple things. One, on the first set of recommendations, it'd be good to get, I don't know if Cal Recycle is the right the place to go for this, but how far can California go when it's talking about limiting trade or even talking about trade in general? And specific to USMCA, I've seen, Canada did a plastic bag ban, and the American Chemistry Council is challenging even that level of local legislation as a violation of the USMCA. So if we can get some clarity from Cal Recycle on sort of where that line stands when it comes to trade would be helpful. On the RDRS, one thing that even if we do the transparency, I don't have a recommendation here. I just want to highlight a mixed plastic bale could be many different things, and you could have a mixed plastic bale of PET, PE, and PP that would still be allowable under the Basel network. I don't think the RDRS, as it's set up right now, would be able to distinguish between that kind of mixed plastic bale and a bale that has other things in it that would violate the Basel amendments. Was that clear enough? And then Nick, I see you rolling, trying to think through it.
Can you explain that last one a little bit again? I'm not as familiar with the RDRS.
Does a mixed plastic bale of polyethylene and polypropylene, according to what we were presented to last week, they can export. Let's put aside the fact that we're not a member of the Basel Convention. That export of that bale is still legal, even though it's a mixed plastic bale. And I'm saying the way the RDRS is set up, there's no distinguishment between that mixed plastic bale and another mixed plastic bale that may not meet those thresholds of what's inside of it.
Okay, so the data that's submitted, you're not submitting it by resin type?
On the mixed bales, it doesn't dig into what the composition of that mixed plastic bale is.
So you can just submit that there's a mixed plastic bale leaving, and that would conflate a legal type and an illegal type.
Each MRF has a lot of flexibility on how they're characterizing their bales.
If I could jump in, Nick, real quick. I think exactly your point to speak to that issue is exactly why we're recommending the recommendations. We're putting these forward, that legislation has to be clear. There needs to be transparency so that a question like the one that you just posed, because I'm in that same situation myself, when we ship materials, there needs to be some clarification in the legislation that defines what is a mixed plastic bale.
Would it be possible, Eric, for you to edit this document when it's in the final, or when it's in the Google?
Yeah, I guess
Yeah.
the hard part is, and this is part where I feel like one of the committees should have this conversation, or the whole board, is how much are we going to then put on the MRFs of doing that kind of analysis on each of their bails? That would be a difficult process to do.
Are you suggesting, Commissioner Potashner, this get kicked to a committee for further deeper dive on this, or just maybe back to?
You know, I think we could push something forward, but need to maybe kick it to Cal Recycle to figure out the best way to make that determination, or maybe there needs to be a change in how RDRS is set up to make that distinction between different types of mixed plastic bales.
Okay.
So maybe Commissioner Lapis and Vice Chair Vallier can work with you on language changes that might address that. And
Commissioner Don Levy has something.
I think I have something as well. I've had my asterisk there too.
Commissioner Schneider and Toyota, and then Ward, and then Osagura. It's the order.
Was that me, Heidi?
Yeah,
Commissioner
sorry.
Schneider. Okay. Hi, thank you. Hey, I love this. I know that these are just recommendations to the committee, but I would love to start moving this out to my local elected officials and to LCC. But I'm guessing that this is going to have to wait till January.
What has to wait till January? Hearing it again?
This particular document. I would love to run the document out and start getting feedback from other elected officials.
Well, as soon as it's public, you can start getting, feedback from anybody. Absolutely.
Excellent. Well done, you guys.
And Commissioner Toyota, I think you're next.
I really like this, and I absolutely support it as well. But I want to kind of continue Commissioner Dell's thoughts, in that I think that this concept of not giving credit for things that aren't recycled or disposed of the way they're supposed to be should follow through to just about every part of this report, because there's no market that we can help create that won't be undermined by something that can just be dumped somewhere else. And there's no education that we can put out that isn't going to be undermined if people find out that it's just going to the landfill, even if it's local. And it kind of it falls into everything that we do, where the recycling committee is trying to say you can only put recycling symbols on what's recyclable. And I would just like to see this concept of transparency and not giving credit for things that aren't disposed of the way they are follow through the report, and also for domestically as well.
Thank you. Sorry, I was hearing background noise. I was just trying to remind everybody to mute if you're not speaking. Great. So then we'll move on to Commissioner Ward.
Mostly, I just did want to touch upon Commissioner Dell's suggestion to look at the legal implications, because that's very much a concern. Local governments need to follow through with the intentions of our customers who put things in the recycling bins. The other thing that I'm recognizing is that we all need to prepare ourselves, because we will be the bearers of bad news. All of these things are going to be essentially saying, all right, you're the Recycling Commission, and your primary recommendation to fix recycling is to stop recycling the following list of things. That's going to be the headline that's going to come out, and we all need to start preparing ourselves for that, as we need to be advocates for fixing the recycling system. But part of it is the bad news that a lot of the stuff people have been told is recyclable is not. And we need to be strategic in thinking about how we're going to be delivering that message, because at least in our local community, when you're the bearer of bad news, you're also often confused with being the source of that.
And the only thing I'll add to that, Commissioner Ward, is that I think the public has found out, because there's been a lot of news stories about how bales of plastic are going into landfills, and they're getting actually disheartened that they are separating things that aren't getting recycled. So it kind of, I think you're right though, how you frame it and how the word gets out is going to take some thought for sure. Commissioner Osagura?
Yeah, I want to echo Commissioner Potashner's comment about asking for, and I think it's also what Commissioner Dell's asking. I mean, she has a certain legal question, right? But I think it's important before I can make a determination, it'd be important that CalRecycle, someone with expertise, explain federal and state trade law and, the commerce law. What cannot be done at this point? What are the pressure points? What could we recommend that would be in opposition, so we would know in opposition of federal law in terms of commerce or state laws in terms of commerce. So, I think it's important to have that type of presentations. These are broad recommendations that have tremendous amount of implications. And I think it's important that someone with expertise, present what those implications could be in terms of commerce. I just think that would make a more informed decision on behalf of the commission.
That would be just a data request add-on really to the initial request, is just expanding on, have CalRecycle come back to us with how these recommendations could affect commerce.
That is correct. And what's the current federal and state commerce clauses? I mean, that this is going to affect. I mean, it's extremely important. For me, it's unproductive to know that, the federal and state commerce clauses of some sort, and I'm not an expert, so I'm way over my skis right now, say X, and what we're recommending cannot go through because of that. We should be well aware of that, and so I want to understand that better.
Agree. So CalRecycle, make sure that's in the notes, because we've now made another data request. Unless others don't agree with that, it sounded like a good idea to me.
I'm not 100% sure. I agree that it's a good question. I think it goes beyond a data request. I mean, I know that there are some law students that are working on a very detailed analysis of this. I don't think it's a clear cut, tell us yes or no, and it might be an unreasonable request of CalRecycle. My thought process. I'm sorry?
They're good at telling us when we've gone too far on requests.
But my thought process on number one is that it's really a question for legislative counsel. If a bill is to be introduced, it's a question for legislative counsel to really give a legal opinion and do the months of research and everything else that's involved. So I would love to get the answer as well, but I'm afraid that it goes beyond a reasonable request.
And I wasn't asking for them to provide a yes, no, you can do this or that, but a better understanding of the commerce clauses. That is, in terms of today's interpretation of what those are. Like you mentioned, Nick, there's a whole group of legal folks looking at this, and it's for a reason, right? And so I would just like an understanding of what those look like, more so than you can do this or not do that.
Segura, I just have a quick question for you. Are you comfortable, because I think the question will come up at the end of this discussion as to whether we continue to hold this or keep it or try to expedite it for the January 1st submittal of policies. And maybe this is just for the whole commission to just think about how ready are we, or what other information do we need in order to move on this item. That's really something for us all to think about. And I think Commissioner Donlevy, you had a comment on something that was said.
Yeah, just with the RDRS system, what Commissioner Patashner was addressing, it has a very extensive list, probably the biggest list of material grades that are out there. So I think somebody can identify whether it's a PET bale or a PET with PP or other acceptable materials. I think the important aspect is right now a facility can say that they're shipping it to a broker, but they don't disclose that it's going overseas. And I think that's the biggest emphasis that we need to have facilities report, is how much material is going overseas, and not disguise it by selling it to a broker in LA who sells it to a broker in Phoenix who then puts it on a boat in Long Beach. There's a lot of ways that you could disguise where the material is going. I just think there needs to be some more emphasis on the California facilities reporting the destination of their material, so people can see where it's going. So if Commissioner Snyder wants to see what's going out of Millbrae, she has access to that. So I think his item 2 is the one that needs a little more emphasis. So people know where the material is actually going, and through the RDRS system, report the actual destination and not just say it's going to a broker. That's my comment.
Robert Savray, did you want to respond to that at all, or?
Yeah, I just want to say that I appreciate all of the comments. I will circle back with the Basel Convention and Jim and Commissioner Lapis to follow through. I think one of the most salient points is what Commissioner Oseguera raised about trade and commerce, etc. Those issues we did discuss, but not as extensively. But I know that those issues came up in different states where the Basel Convention was discussed. What I mean by state, I mean nation states, because they have similar laws in other parts of the world, Germany, France, Great Britain, etc. And those questions did come up. So I will do some more research and get back some response and help Cal Recycle here on a local level to follow through on those. So you have my commitment on that, because that's an important issue.
Bird, do you have a comment? Commissioner Ward, are you frozen?
I just think this is something that needs to move for the January 21 report, because it's very relevant. And my understanding from the presentation of the Basel Conventions was that a lot of these laws become effective January 20.
And I know you and I have also talked about if we did adopt something along this lines, we didn't plan on it in the report, so where would we put it? So you and I have to think about that as well. And Commissioner Kalbakoff, you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Heidi. So I appreciate this conversation on export of plastic waste, and I know there's been a lot of work, and Jan done a lot of background information on where this plastic's coming from. One of the conversations that I think we need to have as well is that as we look at the best and highest use of plastics and not exporting them, or having a conversation about exporting and not exporting, the implications it has on local MRFs, local jurisdictions, and franchise agreements that require high diversion of or elimination of landfill. And we're looking at not exporting, whether that's a policy recommendation of exporting plastics that may get recycled and may not get recycled. That's the gray area, or how much is getting recycled in that bale. What we're saying is that 100% of that will go into the landfill, which will implicate obviously local franchise agreements and diversion and jurisdiction. So that conversation, I think we can get support if there's the possibility of Cal Recycle looking at the way diversion's measured. And if it's not going to be exported and it's going to be driven to the landfills, then, and that's going to be a policy recommendation, I think there needs to be a further look into how that implicates franchise agreements in local jurisdictions and MRFs.
Okay, so Commissioner Lapis, are you done?
Heidi, your audio's cutting out.
I'm sorry. I'll speak louder too.
We didn't hear what you said earlier.
Oh, I'm sorry. All I said was good points. And Commissioner Lapis.
Yeah, if I could maybe make a recommendation on these 4 items. It sounds like on item number 1, there's some open legal questions, and we as a group can decide. It sounds like we might need to do a little more research and have some more conversations before deciding if it's a recommendation. On number 2, which is the reporting, it sounds like that one needs some work. I would hate to put John Sitz on the spot because he's here to do another presentation. I would love to get his take since he's the numbers guy and really the expert on RDRS in terms of which of this data is available, which would have to be collected separately, et cetera. So I would love to get John's response if possible, but it seems like 2 needs some work. 3 and 4 seem relatively ready to go. And to Kalpakov's comment earlier about, the diversion credit. And I mean, I think the fear is that the diversion credit is what's driving us to send stuff that is not recyclable overseas, where it is then being dumped. And that's kind of a worst case scenario of unintended consequences of our policies. So I'm in agreement there. So my recommendation, is to move 3 and 4 forward and hopefully get to 1 and 2 before the January 1st report is done.
Okay. There's a recommendation. We've got a few more comments, I think, before we address that real quick, because I think this is super important, especially if we're going to move any of these now into the draft report for first reading. So Commissioner Toyota.
Yeah, this might actually be more for the Labeling and Education Committee, but I'd like to see, I think it's important, especially as Commissioner Ward said, it's somewhat sort of bad news, but I think that CalRecycle needs to make a public commitment that what they take in and what's happening with these materials and is going to be exactly what they say is, and they need to push that out in their education and make that commitment public and bring back some of those folks who are so distraught about having recycled and ended up trashing the oceans. That's all. Thanks.
Okay.
I think you called me. I wanted to make 2 comments. One is that I'm hoping that we don't set ourselves up to a standard that's too difficult to achieve. And what I mean by is I would encourage Commissioner Lapis to actually move all 4 of these recommendations forward and fine-tune them just as we are with the other proposals rather than piecemealing it. In particular, with recommendation 1, are we as a group which is focused on expertise on recycling and waste issues trying to develop an expertise beyond what we have in answering questions that may not actually be resolved until some case ends up at the Supreme Court, years in the future? Getting back to what we're recommending, it's a pretty straightforward recommendation, and I think it's solid on its own. It could certainly be phrased maybe a little bit stronger, but it's really something we're presenting to the legislature and its Leg Council that really should be determining whether it needs to be amended or presented in a different way or tied to a different statute. I don't want us to drill down into that level of detail where we want to recommend, even the fact that we're trying to address the USMCA in this proposal. I think that's great, but it's even that may be beyond what our recommendation is. We're simply saying California shouldn't be violating international law by shipping material that we know isn't actually recycled and calling it recycling. That's the bottom line. And that's the heart of this proposal. I hope that it can be moved forward substantially similarly. Same thing with the recommendation too. It's fundamentally about people that place materials out and the jurisdictions and the folks that are in that supply line knowing where the material ends up. And so we can fine tune the wording, and I certainly encourage folks to work with Commissioner Lapis and Commissioner Valle to do that. But I would maybe have a counter proposal to Commissioner Lapis to move this forward in whole and refine it by the January report. And the other thing I wasn't planning to mention, but just to speak to Commissioner Dell's comments earlier, we don't really have a definition of recycling for jurisdictions to be deciding whether to list something as recyclable or not. That's the whole reason this commission exists. So I don't know that we could say that it's illegal or improper for anyone to be advertising something as recyclable. Certainly not just based on markets, because we know that there's at least 7 factors that go into whether something is really recyclable or not. But I think it's a good question for us to consider once we do have a legal definition for recycling. Thanks.
Thank you. So that's another proposal. And Commissioner Valle?
Last thing, I just want to announce that I have to meet a recycling deadline for a city. So after this item, I will have to depart. Thank you.
Okay, and Commissioner Davis?
I guess I'm trying to clarify whether we're talking, or if we're focused on the Basel Convention impacts. Recommendation number 2 in the title is fairly clear, although it doesn't say export destinations. But the body of the recommendation is much broader and not only doesn't focus on plastic exports or plastic, it leaves kind of addresses all materials. And I'm not clear what our focus is, if we're narrowly focused on Basel Convention or trying to address a broader issue on number 2. On number 3, I like the export of mixed plastics should be considered disposal. And I think Mr. Potashner raised the issue that there are some mixed bales of allowable materials, PET, H2PE, polypropylene, that could be mixed and exported under the Basel Convention. So that needs to get fixed. The title, to me, diversion credits, had always kind of been a poke because it really gets to whether something's disposed or not. And so I think it might be clear on the title that we're talking about these non-acceptable mixed plastic bales being disposal. So, but I guess my question is, how narrowly focused are we on the Basel Convention issues, and should we be trying to avoid entangling other topics in this recommendation, which I fully support in concepts.
Commissioner Valle or Lapis, did you want to respond quickly to that?
Yeah, I think since the state cannot engage in any policy for international trade, I think we can only make recommendations that are broadly applicable to all laws, all countries, all destinations, all materials. The closer we get to saying specifically Basel Convention, the murkier the legal ground gets.
And I think somebody else raised the point. I don't know any of us are legal scholars in this area as well. So, and we're just recycling experts in our specific areas. So I think we have to be, cognizant that we may put out some recommendations that need more thought. We're not going to be here able to be an expert in every single thing all the way down to the nth degree and get any sort of recommendations over to the legislature. And they know that. And I think we could preface that in the report as well, that we acknowledge that. And so I guess we're going to have to move on to our next agenda item. We're running quite behind at this point, but I didn't want to stop this very important discussion too soon. So I'm going to take a few more of the comments real quick of the commissioners so you've all had a chance to speak, and then we can decide what to do. So Commissioner Dell, you're next.
Yeah, I'd just like to support what Joseph Kalpakoff, Commissioner Kalpakoff said, and tie it with what Commissioner Ward said. I mean, the world has changed from 10 years ago, and these contracts that MRF signed with cities, the expectation of stakeholders on what's recyclable, and we can magically get to a 75% diversion rate. All of that needs to get reset. And there's some legal aspects to that. MRFs agreed to take a lot of things out of pressure because other MRFs were taking it, and who knows where it went. So we were really living in recycling Disneyland, and we didn't know where it was all going. And now is the time to reset. But I do think it's important that we reset to really understand what's recyclable today so that we can strategically then add more things to the list. But until we get real about what actually is, what there is a market for and not, then we won't know what's the strategic use of investment funds to add in carton processing or something. And so that's why it is really important to get back at it. But there's a lot to it, including existing contracts that cities have with MRFs based on 10-year-old contracts. Thank you.
Petashner, can you hear me?
Yeah, no, okay. Real quickly, I just want to second what
Commissioner
Davis
Petashner, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can. Want to just second what Commissioner Davis said about aligning our mixed for recommendation 3, the mixed plastic export definition with what the Basel Convention has for mixed for the ban. So that's all.
Okay, and then I think we have some public comments.
Yes, we have one.
So CalRecycle could read off the.
We have one public comment. It is from Sarah Bloomquist from Tomra. It says, hi, when referring to the statewide recyclables list and as briefly discussed, when communicating it to the public, it's important to clarify that the list is what is currently recycled, not everything that is actually, quote, recyclable. For example, thermoforms and PP are both recyclable. However, the current infrastructure in California does not meet the requirements to put it on the list. They are recyclable, but they are not recycled at a level sufficient to make the list. Thank you.
I had a quick response to that.
Yes.
The law, I mean, specifically the law we're implementing reclassifies recyclable as meaning that it gets recycled, because technically anything is recyclable. And the standard before this was it's recyclable if it's collected in 60% of programs. And that was changed to it's recyclable if it's that plus 6 other things. And so I think that's actually important that we not back away from saying these are the things that are recyclable. And the reason it's important is probably not the ones that were just mentioned, those comments, but folks like expanded polystyrene and others have been claiming that they're recyclable because technically you can recycle them, even though that has never happened in their 30-year history of trying to get it recycled.
And that gets to my point about follow the money too. If there's no money for the infrastructure to ensure that things have closed loop systems, that also means it won't get recycled. Commissioner Valle,
yeah, in the interest of moving this conversation along, this is the first time that the public has seen these recommendations and that we've publicly talked about it amongst ourselves. So I'd like Commissioner Sky's suggestion that we move forward with these, but simultaneously Commissioner Lapis and I will continue to work on the points that people have raised so that we can bring it to closure by the January meeting recommendation time. I'd like to make that recommendation going forward.
If that's a motion, I'll second.
So that would mean that, just to make sure we're all clear, so that would move that this commission today approves these 4 recommendations as they're written to go into the report for the first reading, and that you'll come back with any proposed edits for the next meeting before the second reading. And if it does get amended again, then it has to have a second reading on those amendments. So it would still basically, okay.
Yes, and taking into account all of the comments that have been raised, which Commissioner Lapis and I will go through thoroughly.
And any public comments that we get now that the public has seen it for the first time as well. Yep. Okay, so is everybody okay with that? We've got a first and a second on a motion to actually move all 4 of these recommendations into the report as first reading. They'll be heard at the next commission meeting and with even further amendments, which means they probably won't have final adoption until the earliest would be December 2nd for the report. Thumbs up? Is everybody okay with that?
I just think it's important what Commissioner Valle said, taking into consideration the comments that were made for potential modifications, all those things. I mean, I think the way you just said it is not that way. You said if, possibly, they will take into consideration those comments that were made, right? So I want to make sure that that's very clear.
We're planning on amending them is basically what we're saying, based on what we've heard today and any future comments that come in that we decide we want to amend it. So I don't want people to think we're going to approve it in the final report on the 18th. We would not. We would hear it for the first time again as with the amendments, and then we would consider it at the earliest time, December 2nd. Okay, just making sure. I'm glad we're all clear. So is everybody okay with that? Thumbs up, that process? Excellent. Okay. Is there anybody who does not agree with that process? Okay, excellent. And I really want to thank Vice Chair Valle and Commissioner Lapis for their hard work on this. Thank you so much. And so we'll put this on the next agenda for a longer period of time because we will have to look at the amendments and spend more time making sure we're confident that this is what we want in the report. Okay, so we were going to take a break, but I'd actually think that we'd like to, if everybody's okay with it, we'll just get into the conversion technology presentation and take a break after that since we've been keeping the CalRecycle staff waiting, if that's okay with all of you. Okay, thumbs up, good. All right, so we'll go ahead and CalRecycle, if we could move on to agenda item number 6, the presentation on conversion technologies and chemical recycling. And this has been we asked you to do this because of all the comments we've received regarding chemical recycling and not clear what the definition is and what that means and how did that impact our ability to meet the goals of getting to 75%. So I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Sitz.
Good morning, Chair Sanborn and Commission members. Today I'm going to discuss conversion technology. I'm going to shorten those 7 syllables to just CT most of the time. Usually CT is a hot topic, but it may be a little early in the morning for that pun. So sorry about that. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to quickly cover several areas around CT, statutory context, some permitting and siting considerations, and then some information on counting for local jurisdiction diversion mandates and for the statewide recycling goal. Before I jump in, I just want to cover a couple quick caveats. I'm just going to cover current requirements, CalRecycle's role. I'm going to be neutral. I'm not calling this for CT or against CT. And I'm going to cover high-level concepts and general principles. So I'm not going to get into every process or every specific site that's been proposed. So the context here starts with the statutes in the Public Resources Code and then the California Code of Regulations. And I'm going to review a series of definitions and requirements. I'm not going to read each of the slides. They're excerpts of the statutes and regulations. And they're in the presentation and they have the numbers with them. So you can look them up for the full text if you want more information on any of them. So to start with, the first definition is just solid waste, which includes just about everything cast off by our society. It's a very, very broad definition. A little spoiler alert, I'm going to distinguish later between solid waste, this everything stuff, and materials that have been separated out of the waste stream. So the definition of disposal starts out very broad as well. Some CT facilities that convert solid waste have air emissions, so those facilities would fall under the first bullet on the disposal to the atmosphere. So that's a very broad definition. The definition also specifically includes transformation facilities. So some CT processes are included in the definition of transformation. So if these CT facilities convert solid waste, they'd also fall under the second bullet for disposal. Now, transformation. This definition clarifies that some CT processes are transformation, including pyrolysis, distillation, biological conversion. Pyrolysis is one of the most discussed conversion technologies. If it's used to convert solid waste, then it is transformation and thus disposal. Now, this definition specifically excludes gasification, EMSW conversion, and biomass conversion, and I'm going to talk about those in the next 3 slides. So gasification. Gasification, as I said, is not transformation. And this second bullet has caused much consternation over the years. Some people say it is technically wrong. Some say it's impossible, and others argue that it would be a better definition for pyrolysis. Regardless, this definition has been in place since 2009, and it's still in effect. So this appears to leave gasification in kind of a practical limbo, or well, probably more like an impractical limbo. EMSW, again, is not transformation. EMSW's facilities also convert materials, but they're clearly defined as a disposal activity, and they have their own sets of requirements. So they're not that relevant to today's discussion of CT. Biomass conversion is also not transformation. This definition, as you can see, allows for the use of non-combustion thermal technologies of specified organic materials. So there's some room for conversion technology within this definition. But biomass facilities are not permitted by CalRecycle, and the material they convert is not counted as disposal for either the jurisdiction mandates or the statewide recycling goals. So they're not as relevant to our discussion today either. So let's have a little high-level discussion of CT permitting considerations. So this definition of solid waste facility includes both gasification and transformation. They're in there. So CT facilities that convert solid waste are solid waste facilities. They must obtain a solid waste facility permit. Now, local enforcement agencies consider approval of permits for solid waste facilities, and then CalRecycle considers concurrence on those permits. Interestingly, there is a statutory exception for facilities that don't take mixed solid waste. So this is that spoiler I talked about before. So if a CT facility takes material that was already separated from the waste stream and does not accept or convert solid waste, then it would not require a permit for this activity. Now, in this section of the California Code of Regulations, CalRecycle has defined a recycling center, and it makes that prior PRC section we just mentioned more specific by adding a three-part test. So an entity that meets the three-part test is a recycling center and is exempt from the permitting requirements for that activity. The three-part test, not surprisingly, includes three parts. The first is the site only takes materials that have been source separated, either by the generator or at a centralized facility. The second part of the test is the site has less than 10% residual waste that's being sent on to disposal. And the third part of the test is the material received has less than 1% putrescibles in it, and it doesn't cause a nuisance. So if a CT facility accepts separated material and it meets the conditions for residuals and putrescibles, then it would be a recycling center, not require a permit for that activity, and not report its tonnages as disposal. Now, a phrase often used in CT discussions, particularly around plastics, is chemical recycling. But there's nothing in the Public Resources Code on this topic. Now, as I understand it, chemical recycling can describe a wide range of processes and results. So these three terms are kicked around quite a bit. Purification separates out the original plastic polymers and recovered plastics for reuse in a new product. Decomposition breaks the recovered plastic down more into either the original monomers or other intermediates that can be used to make new products or different plastics. And then finally, conversion breaks the recovered plastic down into fundamental smaller molecules, all the way down to hydrogen, for example, that can be used to remake plastic or be used as fuels or to make other chemicals. So it's really fundamental building blocks at that point. Now, without a specific direction in statute, a CT facility doing chemical recycling would be treated like any other CT facility based on the 3-part test. So if it meets the 3-part test, then it would be a recycling center. It wouldn't require a permit, and it wouldn't report its tonnages as disposal. But if it fails the test, then it would need a solid waste facility permit, and it would report its tonnages as disposal. Next, let's talk a little bit about siting of these facilities. This section establishes the siting process for solid waste facilities. So if a CT facility meets the 3-part test, it wouldn't need a permit. So it would not need to meet these criteria for siting. However, local land use requirements would still apply, as would the best practices for public participation and community involvement. If a CT facility does require a solid waste facility permit and they fall under transformation, such as pyrolysis, then the facility would need to be identified in the countywide siting element that deals with the siting of disposal facilities. If a CT facility requires a solid waste facility permit, but is not transformation, such as gasification, then it would need to be identified in a jurisdiction's non-disposal facility element. So adding a CT facility with a solid waste facility permit will require a local government to amend one of their planning documents. Excuse me. But there's a big difference in difficulty between the two. For a countywide siting element, inclusion of a new facility requires majority approval. That means the county and a majority of the cities that have a majority of the population must approve it. In counties with lots of cities, that can be very difficult. Countywide siting elements are also subject to the California Environmental Quality Act. So for a non-disposal facility element, only one jurisdiction using the facility must approve of the inclusion of the facility into an NDFE. And in addition, non-disposal facility element amendments are statutorily exempt from CEQA. So NDFEs are a lot easier. All right, finally, let's discuss a little bit about how CT counts for jurisdiction diversion mandates and for the statewide recycling goal. So progress toward the 50% diversion mandate is measured by looking at each jurisdiction's per capita disposal every year and comparing it to a base period. So for jurisdictions, diversion is not measured directly. There's no such thing as diversion credits. Rather, jurisdictions are assessed on any reductions or increases in disposal. And this disposal only includes disposal at permitted solid waste disposal facilities. So that's the only thing that counts against a jurisdiction. CalRecycle's Recycling and Disposal Reporting System, or RDRS, requires many types of facilities to report each quarter. If a CT facility has a solid waste facility permit, it would be required to report. A permitted CT facility that converts mixed solid waste would be required to report, and the solid waste converted there would count as jurisdiction disposal. If a CT facility meets a 3-part test and thus does not require a solid waste facility permit, it would not be required to report as a disposal facility, and the material converted would not count as jurisdiction disposal. It would report under the same requirements as recyclers or composters. So it would report on the types and amounts of materials, but it wouldn't be by jurisdiction of origin, and it wouldn't be counted as disposal. Now, while there are some differences between jurisdiction measurement and statewide measurement, they're pretty similar in this area. Statewide progress is also measured by examining annual disposal amounts and comparing them to a base period. It's a different base period, but it is still a base period. Recycling is not measured directly for the statewide goal either. but rather progress is assessed by examining any reductions or increases in disposal. So if a CT facility has a permit and converts solid waste, it would be considered a disposal facility, and the solid waste converted would count towards statewide disposal. If a CT facility meets the three-part test, it would not be considered a disposal facility, and the material converted would not count towards statewide disposal. Now, we covered a little bit of the CT statutory context, some permitting and siting considerations, and some counting issues. I know that was a lot of information in the statutory section, so thank you for your patience. That concludes my presentation, but I would be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Really appreciate it. And it's good to work with you again. John and I worked together for probably 30 years, I think, way back in CalRecycle days, or California Integrated Waste Management Board days. So I'll see some comments coming in from the commissioners, starting with Commissioner Davis.
John, just to be clear, so we can focus a little bit on transformation includes pyrolysis and distillation, correct? So if the processes, these chemical recycling processes, whatever, involve pyrolysis or distillation, would that necessarily slot those as transformation?
The pyrolysis and distillation are included in the definition of transformation, and transformation is considered disposal. But the three-part test discussion still applies. So if you convert solid waste, mixed solid waste, with pyrolysis or distillation, then yes, that's transformation, that is disposal. If you had a clean supply, whether it's virgin material or recovered material of like a single plastic, and it went through pyrolysis, that would likely meet the three-part test, and it would be considered a recycling center, not transformation or disposal.
So on the three-part test, separated, the language is separated for reuse, and the reuse part always throws me, but the separation, if something is separated into plastics, 3 through 7 plastic, or a mix of plastic as opposed to individual grades of plastic, is it separated if it's combined grades?
I've got esteemed colleagues on here at this meeting as well, so I think I'll let Mark DeBee or maybe Harley Branch address that.
Thanks.
This is Mark DeBee. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So if the intent in separating those plastics 3 through 7, I think you said, was to move it towards recycling and into new products, it wouldn't matter if it was a mixed load or separated out by number. If, however, some of those materials are diverted with the intent of being recycled, and they go to a facility and the facility says, I'm not handling 7s or 5s or whatever, and discard that, and because of that end up sending over 10% of what they receive to disposal, then they would fail that part of the test, the 10% part of the test.
Yeah, and this is Harley. I think that requirement is designed to differentiate the recycling centers from transfer processing facilities that would be taking in sort of mixed waste. So just to add that on top of what Mark said.
Okay, and if I could ask one more kind of existential question, is energy, a recycled product. You know, breaking down PET into the PET polymers would be one thing, but as I read about some of these processes, there's often a caveat that, or we can use it as fuel, which to me implies they're not really breaking it down into the individual polymer components, but taking whatever's left over and introducing it into an energy recovery process. I guess my question is it recycled if it's used strictly as an energy fuel?
I'm going to address kind of that in a sideways manner. And that is for when you look at how we measure disposal and jurisdiction progress and statewide progress, we look at what is still being disposed. And so for the material that goes to permitted disposal facilities, that's disposal. For things that go other places, practically speaking, you're reducing disposal. So if material goes to a recycling center, and I'm just talking the practical aspects here, that is defined, that is a recycling center, it's not permitted as a disposal facility. They would not be reporting that material as disposal. And so it wouldn't count against anybody as disposal.
Yeah, this is Mark to be again. I think John's making the distinction that the calculation of what counts towards these goals can be different than the reality of materials being disposed either to land, water, or air. So there is a slight distinction to be made there.
Everybody get that? Seeing confused faces. I just want to make sure everybody understands it. All right. I think Commissioner, are you done, Commissioner Davis? Your questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll move on to other people, and then we can go back if there's other comments. How about Commissioner Lapis? You're next.
Thank you for that presentation, John. This is very complicated, and having gone back and forth in the statutes book and having it all dog-eared and marked up and cross-referenced, you did one of the better jobs I've seen of connecting those dots and laying it out. That's not to say that it's easy to understand even despite that, but thank you for that presentation. I think that's incredibly helpful, and I'm going to save it and use it in the future. I think for purposes of the commission, I think, and in the comments we've gotten about chemical recycling, I think John's point about chemical recycling not being a specific thing is very important. Chemical recycling is a broad term that includes things that are recycling and things that are not recycling. And we as a commissioner are supposed to recommend achieving the goals, the various goals that are outlined. All of those goals are about increasing recycling. So there's some forms of chemical recycling that we could recommend increasing, and there's some forms of chemical recycling that we can't because that's not within the scope of our recommendations. And again, I really don't think chemical recycling is a helpful term whatsoever, because we don't necessarily ask, and a couple of you have heard me go off on this rant, so maybe I'll just keep it short, but we don't ask a PET reclaimer what technology they're using to recycle their PET, right? And so you look at something like a polypropylene acid-based recycling process, which some people refer to as chemical recycling. That's polypropylene reclaiming. As long as they're recycling the polypropylene and it's not becoming fuel or garbage, then it's polypropylene reclaiming and it's not disposal, and that's fine. Same thing with or organic materials that go to a conversion facility. That's biomass. You know, it is something that we count as non-disposal, and that's fine. On the flip side, there are plenty of forms of chemical recycling that are disposal, and it's not our job to recommend changing those definitions. It's our job to recommend complying with the goals that are in the statute. And I mean, the best analogy I can come up with is, issuing somebody asking us to issue a recommendation that dessert is good for you because fruit is dessert. It's true, fruit is dessert, but so is chocolate cake, right? I mean, it's not a helpful comment to say that dessert is good for you. And I could go on, and I've spent years arguing about some of the stuff with a lot of the folks who submitted comments. So I'm hoping to avoid getting into that same prolonged fight in the context of this commission.
Basically, you're recommending that we focus on complying with the existing law the way it is and not trying to change it.
Yeah, and if that means that the Market Development Commission or Committee recommends incentives for some forms of chemical recycling that we consider recycling in California, that's fine. I mean, if we were to say, for example, we want to create an incentive where everybody who recycles a ton of polypropylene should get, $500 from the state. Okay, then we apply that to recycling, no matter what type of recycling it is. We don't apply that to disposal, no matter what type of disposal it is. And I think that's how we should be looking at these issues.
Rano?
Thank you for the report. Just a quick question. I wanted to know if any other state has adopted a chemical recycling definition?
I am not aware of any other state that has, but I haven't extensively researched that either. I did look through quite a few different reports, and I didn't see anything about official, but I could be wrong about that.
I would ask the industry that have been, and the commenters who've been submitting comments, if they're aware of any country or any other state that has defined this, or how they would propose it be defined. Because I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, is what is it exactly that we're talking about? Because I don't think everybody's clear on what it is we're talking about, and that's where we have to start the conversation. Okay, so Commissioner Potashner, I think you're next.
Yeah, two things. One on that, this question said, from what I've seen, and again, I think the commenters should weigh in here, I've seen some states move this process towards a manufacturing process versus a solid waste process, and that's how they kind of deal with it. And apologies if this was already answered during the presentation. I lost connection for a second. On the three-part test, for what counts as the point of generation, blue bin material, I'll just give you an example. I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. A recycling program, curbside recycling program, has a blue bin with mixed material. That material then gets sorted at a MRF and baled. And then a plastic, whatever, let's just call it a single resin plastic bale, then goes to a advanced recycling or a chemical recycling plant. Is the MRF the point of generation, or is the curbside customer the point of generation?
I think for the purposes of the three-part test, the material just needs to be separated prior to arrival at that facility. So it could have been separated by the original generator or subsequently at a facility like a MRF. So you don't have to identify, or it doesn't have to be sorted by the generator. It can just, as long as by the time it arrives at that facility, it is separated material and not solid waste.
Understood. Thank you for your clarification.
Commissioner Ward?
Just a quick comment on pyrolysis. My understanding, in order for a pyrolysis facility to be considered a recycling facility, they would have to have nearly 100% markets for their finished carbon. And good luck with that. Carbon black is a very widely used chemical material, but it's very easily created, and so has very high performance standards for the marketed carbon black. Pyrolysis generally produces a pretty low grade.
Yeah, and that gets to the.
I think we have some public comment. Okay.
We do have 3 public comments. 2.
Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say that, yes, that gets to the residuals part of the 3-part test. And if you're not below the 10% residual, then you fail the 3-part test. So, yeah.
I think Chair Sanborn's video is a little delayed, so Laura, if you want to go ahead.
That sounds good. Thanks, Kate. So we have 3 comments. 2 are from the same person and very similar, so I can read both of those or just one into the record. Is there a preference on whether to read one or both? Okay, so I will go. So the first comment is from NREP USA, Daniel Velasquez. Regarding advanced recycling, please consider workshops with stakeholders involved in this new groundbreaking industry at a time that the international community is limiting the waste export as disclosed in the latest meetings of the Basel Convention. Also, petrochemical end products derived from the process of advanced recycling can range from the production of new plastics, waxes, and even to power the engines and machinery needed for the drilling and extraction of lithium for EV batteries in the mining sector. The second comment is also from Daniel Velasquez of NREP USA. It says, regarding advanced recycling, please note that the end products range from petrochemicals to make new plastic fuels, waxes, and even gas for electricity. The byproducts, such as carbon black, have great use in the agriculture and rubber industry. Even more, end products of chemical recycling can power the engines for the extraction of lithium in the mining industry for EV batteries, since the mining industry relies on fuels for its operations. Hence, chemical recycling can take contaminated materials not able to be recovered under mechanical recycling. And all 3 will be published, but I will just read those 2 since the similarity of the third one.
Thank you. I don't see any more comments in the chat. So here, I'm going to make a proposal because we're running pretty far over on our meeting today on time. And I don't see any other. Oh, I see. Commissioner Sky, you want to say something before I wrap it up?
I'll be very brief, actually. I agree with Commissioner Lapis. I think we shouldn't get hung up on what technology is being used. It's really about the feedstock and whether the material being processed meets a 3-part test or not. And whether it's the work of the commission or the folks that want to present to us, I think we should push them in that direction and say that for the proponents of chemical recycling or whatever terminology they want to use, we would encourage them to work with CalRecycle and determine whether the facility they're proposing meets a 3-part test or not. And then for our policies, I hope that we're consistent in saying, is it recycling or not? And that would be based on that test.
So that was going to basically be my suggestion, is that we pose to all those who have commented to please look at the 3-part test. And if you feel that your process, whatever you want to call it, chemical recycling or something else, meets the definition of recycling and will help us meet our goals as a commission to find a way to get to 75% or reduce contamination or create markets, then please, in writing, give us that information so we can have it and decide which committee it should go to, when it would be heard, how much time it's given, what kind of questions we might have back for you, because we simply will not have time for every you know, everybody to have the floor, we'd never be able to get to policy discussions. So we need you to help us, help you, because we do want to hear from those who are meeting the definition of recycling and are going to help us achieve the goals of the commission. But we need it in writing. Just asking for floor time is not really enough. And it's not that we're not being responsive. We just have to be careful with our time. It's the most precious thing we have. Is there anybody that wants to say anything else to those who have commented on conversion technology outside of just asking for more specific information from all of them? Or because I heard Commissioner Potashner suggest that we have them present to a committee or to the commission in future meetings without any more information. So I guess I just want to open it up to the commission. Is there anything else you'd like to do with these many requests we've had about chemical recycling at this point? Commissioner Dunleavy.
Thank you. In California, are there any chemical recycling facilities now? And if so, what are they buying? What material are they taking in and what's the value? Because I'm just trying to have a hard time understanding conversion technology, chemical recycling, plasma arc. A lot of this technology that's out there is pretty expensive. So are we talking about a technology that is going to pay collection programs 10 cents a pound, 15 cents a pound, something to pay for the collection and processing and delivery of that material to these facilities? Or are we going to spend time, listening about a technology that costs $400 a ton when landfill costs are, $50 to $75 to $100 a ton, which just wouldn't make sense for any recycling facility or solid waste facility to deliver the material. Are we going to be in the same the same situation that the carpet people are under, where they can't get carpet because they're only paying a freight cost for the material, or the thermoform people that want all this material, but there's no financial incentive. So help me understand, the chemical recycling, what facilities are out there and how is it going to benefit all the current collection and recycling programs?
That's basically a request of the commenters who have suggested we take this up or here. Okay, so what I'm going to suggest is that the vice chair and I draft an official written response to the commenters on the letter that was submitted on October 12th, because basically most of this letter were complaints about our process, but it wasn't, feeling ignored and the lack of acknowledgement and inclusion in our discussions. And clearly now we are discussing this as we said we would, but what we're asking for is more information that's very specific. What facilities are in California that you call chemical recycling? Which facilities are meeting the 3-part test as John Sitz laid out? That would then meet our definition of recycling, which could then help us meet the 75% goal. And possibly we can talk about that in the market development committee then as something we should help drive that market. But we don't have enough information, really. And just having an oral presentation that's open-ended without getting these details, I think could be very time consuming. So if you're all okay with that, then I'll work with the vice chair on a letter response asking for this information and encourage the companies. We want to hear from you. We just need more specifics, but particularly that you meet the 3-part test to get to the definition of recyclable. That right? Thumbs up?
Can we also add that they provide information on their track records at other facilities? So I know, having talked to a lot of these folks, they'll say, well, we have a facility in X state that is doing this, but there's a lot of other information we would need to know, like the uptime, the successful generation of products, et cetera.
Well, I think another good question, we can certainly add that, I've written that down, is who's going to pay for this? Because these can be very expensive, and what's the proposal on funding them if they're actually defined as recycling? How is that going to work? Give us the picture of how this is going to work, because I think we're all struggling with what exactly is this and how would it fit into us meeting our goals? Okay, so unless I hear any other comments, looks like Commissioner Sky, you want to say something else?
There's also public comments, but just in terms of your last comment, the question about how we fund the facilities is the issue for us to help solve. That's kind of the charge that we were given, assuming that these are facilities that actually are recycling facilities. It's the exact same issue with anaerobic digestion and composting and everything else. Who's going to pay for it? How do we fund it? How do we make sure that the incentives are there so we don't continue just sending more and more material to landfills, which is what we've been doing for nearly a decade straight now?
If they're charging for the material or not paying enough, it's not going to work anyway on a market-based system. So are there more public comments?
There is one additional public comment from NREP from Daniel Velasquez, and it says, several other states have passed legislation regarding chemical recycling: Texas, Iowa, Florida, Wisconsin, Illinois, just to name a few. American Chemistry Council has a full list of states with passed and proposed legislation.
We would love to see all of that. And I would encourage them to actually submit it in the portal so the whole world can see what legislation has passed, what does it actually do, etc. That would be very helpful, I think. Thank you. Okay, so I'll work with Commissioner Valle on a response letter. This video was recorded. They can watch this as well if they couldn't be on the call today. And we're certainly not ignoring those comments. So with that, I think we're going to take, why don't we give it give it until 11:10, which is 8-minute break. And then we'll come back and pick up on our committee reports. Sound good? 8 minutes? Okay. See you in 8 minutes. Thank you. Okay, everybody ready to come back? Now everybody's looking at their phones. What about the election? Tough day to try and have a focused meeting. Okay, so we'll move on to our committee reports. Looks like we've got a few more people out for a second. And last time on our committee reports, we had a long presentation and great recommendations starting to get into the report from market development, which is where we started. So we'll end with that today. And I'd propose that we start maybe with the organics committee. I don't see Mr. Petashner back yet though. So if he might take a little bit to come back, maybe we should start with recycling, but I don't see Mr. Dunleavy back yet. And again, this is the danger of taking a break during elections. Everybody's glued to their televisions. There he is. Okay. So Commissioner Petashner, would you be okay to start with the report out on the organics committee work today?
Sure. We have not had a meeting since our last commission-wide meeting. We have one on Monday, so I will have more at that point.
Okay, so there's nothing new to report from?
Nope. Trying to get us back on schedule.
Okay, and so the recommendations we have from this committee so far that are already into the report draft are on the. We have two of them from the last time.
Yeah, you have one on the precautionary principle and PFAS for compostable packaging, and you have one on food waste prevention in the document now. I anticipate after our Monday meeting, you'll have one on infrastructure and on end markets as well.
Okay, and I guess I'll ask.
Have you got something?
Yeah, briefly. I think that the food policy one needs to include a recommendation that there be an assessment of the existing and potential future need for food rescue, as that infrastructure assessment was not included in the assessment that's been provided by CalRecycle. And that would be an additional item. Happy to craft that.
You're suggesting that committee take that up and add that to the recommendation?
Yes. Yeah, and we'll add that language.
Okay.
Ted, would it be possible for you to make that a suggestion on the actual document? So write in the language you would like to see.
I would be happy to do that, but we are having an organics committee meeting, so it seems most appropriate that I should forward it there and then bring it back.
The reason I say that is we already passed that from the organics committee as sort of a final recommendation. So at this point, I think any changes should just be directly on the final document so we don't keep going back to the committee level for each of these.
Totally
changes.
Okay with that. You okay with that, Eric, and other members of the organics? Okay, we'll do it in the document so everybody reads the document. That's great.
As long as the committee members that it came from, agree with that process, that's great. If it were controversial, I would say probably should go back to the committee, but it doesn't seem to be.
That's an important caveat, and we did. Ted, I believe you did raise that in the past, and I think we all agreed, and then it never made it into the recommendation. So that's a good caveat. Thank you, Heidi.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. So that's our report out. So I would just encourage again all the commissioners to read the organics section of the report on food recovery and on the precautionary principle and PFAS, and make sure you're really comfortable with it, because it's already in there, and we actually had planned on today under this agenda item approving those two as a second reading, because they were approved as first reading, and now I'm hearing that Ted has some possible amendments. So with that, maybe we should hit pause on both of them, or just one of them.
Since it was clear on everybody, following this meeting, we convert all that red text to black, and then the additional section that I just discussed, I add in red, so everybody's clear on the new stuff.
That's
And Heidi, I think we can at least move the compostable packaging precautionary principle today.
So with that, then this would be where we would do that. So is there anyone on the commission that has any concerns about the write-up on the precautionary principle proposal and banning the PFAS from the foodware? Because if not, then I think we should make it official, and it's part of the, and again, the report can still be pulled back and still modified prior to January 1st submittal, but this would be the first recommendation that's finished and actually in as black final writing in the report. So is there, I guess I'm just going to ask for a thumbs up. Is everybody okay that this is the second reading and it's official, the PFAS recommendation precautionary principles in the report? Awesome. Is okay. Osagura, great. Then is there anybody who's opposed to that? Not one. That's a consensus. Thank you so much. How exciting. That's our first official done part of the report. Okay, well done, commissioners. And then Ted, you'll go ahead and make some edits to the food recovery section, but the other part of this is approved. If we should do the same thing with that. And then any edit you make to it, everybody would see, and we'd have to approve that separately at the next, well, actually, it would be first reading for that and then second reading at a follow-up meeting. Okay, so is everybody okay to approve the food recovery proposal as official second reading adopted in the report to go to the legislature on January 1st? Everybody okay? Thumbs up? Is there anybody that is not okay and would give a thumbs down? John, I'm sorry, you've got comment?
There's a, if you read the, I think it's item, sorry, I had it up and I switched back. It's on my copy, page 17. It's sustainable funding for food recovery organizations. It starts with a sentence that's scrambled. So I'm not sure that needs to be fixed.
Thanks for bringing that up. I'd seen that too, and I forgot to bring it up myself. Yeah, it says expand cycle food event cure condom. I mean, it doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, I don't know what it means. Yeah, I don't know what it means. I didn't want to move it forward without knowing what that means. But on number 9,
thanks. I had forgot to bring that up.
No, number 9 says incentivize local jurisdictions to include funding for food recovery.
Let's before we get a comment from the people who drafted what that was intended. Can we people who did this what intended to be?
Yeah. What are the incentives? Usually, it's telling them what to do.
In talking to the food banks and other food recovery organizations, they have complained about not having consistent funding. And the one idea that's come up is for them to be funded as part of the recycling infrastructure through rates, through franchise fees, et cetera. So they have consistent funding. The reason it's written as incentivize local jurisdictions is we didn't feel that there was a consensus on the commission to mandate. But it is something that the state should do is encourage consistent local funding for food recovery organizations like food banks.
Yeah, I like the local funding, Nick. The SB 1383 final draft regulations are pretty explicit about what jurisdictions must do to assure there's adequate capacity. And so I'm not sure how this squares with that. In our case, we're talking about issues outside what's discussed here, and so I don't want to limit, and I don't want to suggest that we're limiting the focus under those 1383 regulations to only increasing solid waste rates on everybody, because it's the food donation. The people who are donating food have some tax advantages in doing that. and there's money on the table, in my view, as a result of that, and we should be really talking about that. I also noted that the final draft regulations specifically exclude edible food as solid waste, which suggests it may lie outside the franchise realm. So, you know, I guess I like the idea of you know, having local support, but it's already, to me, it's explicit in the 1383 regulations. I'm a little concerned about focus on this.
So in my opinion, it's not explicit. You know, whether or not we make it a recommendation is a decision of the group. But you know, this originally came out when a big group of us, in the context of the core technical council, sat down with the Alameda Food Bank, and we were talking through their economics, and it seems like the way to have a sustainable food recovery infrastructure to help local governments comply with 1383 is to have ongoing funding through a rate structure. That is the recommendation. If the group does not agree with it, we can take it out, but I don't think that's covered by 1383.
Maybe we could look, I'd be glad to look at the language in the regulations and maybe square this one, if it would be okay just to hold this one for till the next meeting rather than move it forward as part of the recommendation. It's pretty explicit that it needs to be in the solid waste rate structure. We work closely. We have a contract. We're funding a comprehensive food recovery organization that has 75 participating members, and so you know what Alameda County might be doing doesn't necessarily work in other places. So if we could just hold this one and bring it back, I'd be more comfortable.
John, I'll work with you on it.
Okay, thank you.
And Commissioner Ward, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I just like to express a little caution about saying that this needs to be in the rate structure. I think there's a variety of different ways to fund this, but very specifically, food rescue is not collecting waste. And it's kind of the nature of waste prevention and source reduction programs. Your primary mission is to recover something that is usable to you. The waste reduction, waste diversion goals are entirely secondary to actually rescuing food and delivering it to people. So it's not necessarily appropriate to be funded through the solid waste infrastructure, and that really should remain a local decision. Although I do agree that they do need a reliable.
Yes, and I would agree with that. And having worked at the Hyatt Regency for getting myself through college and running banquets, I can tell you the structure of how they get people to buy a whole lot of food that they really don't need is pretty, you know, it's incentivizing over purchasing of food at banquets and causes a lot of leftover food. And I guess that's a whole nother thing, is how do we get to source reduction of some of this food so it's not, we don't have so much left over too. But I think if we've got language that doesn't even make sense, it tells me that maybe we need more time to read this and be more thorough with this one. And I see a hand up. Is that Commissioner Sky?
Yeah, I'd put an asterisk earlier. I think you had missed me. That typo was something that I corrected when I sent this language to CalRecycle staff back in September. So I'm not sure how it got reintroduced, but it's supposed to say expand food recovery infrastructure. And it was something where when we were saving it from the Google Docs to a Word version so that we were back then trying to create a version that could be posted on CalRecycle's website. And now that it's back to Google Docs, I think it got reintroduced that way. But that's what it's supposed to say.
Recovery infrastructure and incentivize local jurisdictions is how it should read. Okay. So we can correct that in the Google Doc and in the report, obviously. And it sounds like maybe, do you want to hold this one or do you want to vote on it now? And Commissioner Potashner?
I'm okay if we with the rest, but sorry.
Yeah. The one thing I want to point out, and my apologies for not bringing this up earlier, is it's a little loose when we're talking about contracts and rates. We have residential rates, we have commercial rates. They could live on two different sort of structures. And there is a question, should residential garbage rates and recycling rates be also funding what is largely going to be a commercial food waste infrastructure issue? So as long as we keep the language pretty loose that allows for those types of, just to deal with that nuance, I think I'm more comfortable with this. So I would support maybe taking one more pass at the language before we put it out.
Okay. Well, then
Maybe
why
can
don't
move
we?
forward everything but 9 and then work on 9?
I think 8, 9. I think 8, because I think 8. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we're moving everything except sections 8 and 9 on the food recovery policy proposal. So we will take 8 and 9 will remain red in the draft report, and the rest would turn to black after this vote. Is everybody okay with that? Thumbs up? So this is basically a vote to leave everything else in there, okay? Potashner, I'm sorry, just want to make sure you're okay? Okay, very good. Anybody opposed? Okay, and before we close this, it looks like Commissioner Schneider had something to say.
I apologize. I was going to comment on 8 and 9 just with gleaming programs, funding mechanism for those, or policy mechanisms. I'm sorry, it's day after Election Day, the phone is ringing. So I didn't really see everything else that we're voting on, but I will assume that all of you did a great job.
Well, it's still, you know, the report isn't done until it's sent over in January. So if you do have time to read it and really find something you want to bring up, you can, any of us or the public could still bring these things back up.
I apologize, everybody. I won re-election, so my phone is ringing constantly, so I'm bouncing back and forth. Thank you.
Congratulations. There's an answer to an election. That's good. Okay.
It means that I will still be liaisoning with the League of California Cities. I will still have that hat on.
Great. Great news. Thank you. Okay. Well, I think we've done the work for the Organics Committee then. We've approved 2 giant sections for the report, and we've got a couple sections that need a little more work. Well done, Commission. Okay, so our next committee, we can, and thank you, Chair Potashner, for your work and the committee on their work. Is it okay to turn this over to Chair Don Levy at this point to give an update on the Recycling Committee?
Sure, thank you. Alrighty, we've had a couple of meetings since our last chance to talk, but before we go through the slides and talk about some bottle bill issues, we do have a few policy recommendations regarding plastics that Commissioner Dell has done quite a bit of work on. And we've talked about them at our committee 3 or 4 times. So I'd like to turn it over to Commissioner Dell to go over the policy recommendations that we're now bringing to the commission level. So Commissioner Dell.
Great, thanks. And actually, it's not just for plastics. This is actually also addresses cans as well. So this is a PowerPoint which presents a draft policy recommendation to the commission to discuss. And then if it's approved or elements of it are approved, then we would take it back to the committee and type it up into text and then bring it back to be considered for the full report. And in fact, I do have a whole draft of the text sort of ready to go, depending on what the commission says today. This is called Design for Recyclability. Here's the great news. This is actually so simple. This policy recommendation is such low-hanging fruit compared to all of the complicated things that we've talked about today. This is actually a policy recommendation that could go into place quickly and would have immediate positive impacts on recycling more items and causing less contamination and less to waste to landfill. And it have essentially no cost to taxpayers, and it's something that companies are already doing. So that's my pre-sell. Next slide, please. And what this is really to say, have a design for recyclability that says non-essential, harmful components that wreck the recyclability of items simply are not allowed on products in California. And the three specific things that I'm going to talk about are all marketing design things. So instead of having design for recyclability, what's happened is we've had design for marketability and shelf appeal, but it's wrecked recyclability in each case. Number one, the proposal is to only have clear PET beverage bottles sold in California. This is actually something that all the beverage companies have willingly done in Japan since 2001. You can see my pictures of problem and simple solution. Actually, a lot of the products that are in green here are sold in clear PET in Japan for 19 years. It's now a law in South Korea. I've heard it's a law in somewhere in Europe, although I haven't tracked that down. Doesn't prohibit selling Diet 7-Up. I like Diet 7-Up from time to time. It just simply says, use clear PET because it has high value and it's easy to recycle. The second item is no combined metal plastic components, particularly these lids, which are on some beverage containers that when they end up in a PET recycling facility, they cause havoc. And actually all three of these ideas, just so that you know, I got these ideas 2 years ago from Paul at Global Plastics. I met him at a plastics conference, and he told me about these problems with these beverage and containers. And I said, well, why are they still doing this? And he goes, I don't know, but they wreak havoc. And I said, well, let's just say don't do those. These are marketing things. And then the third one is this increasing use of these shrink sleeve labels that in PET actually wreck the PET recycling, and then on other items on HDPE cause havoc in sorters. And so you've got an HDPE bottle that would be recyclable if it had a standard label on it, but if you put the shrink sleeve on it, then the sorters can't see it and it's taken to waste. That's the overall three proposals today. Next slide, please. So we talked about this at the recycling committee. We introduced it September 11th, talked about it again on the 25th, on the 9th of October, and then now at the October 23rd meeting, we agreed to move it to the commission for full discussion. And along the way, we heard public comments, and we addressed those public comments along the way, and so now it's at the full commission. Next slide, please. So there's benefits to all Californians in doing this. This is just actually so simple. There's no taxpayer funds that would be required. We don't have to create a new program at Cal Recycle or budget new people. It's simply saying those three elements that make these products not recyclable are not allowed. Similar to what we've done on other things in the state, like no pull tax or no other things, right? It's not a ban on the product. It doesn't stop selling the items in plastic or cans. Sometimes have these shrink sleeve labels. Products can still be sold. Consumers can still enjoy them, but they just will be made so that they can be easily recycled in the state. And so the other benefits are that it reduces plastic waste or aluminum waste to landfill, reduces harms to reprocessing equipment, improves the economics for MRFs. MRFs need to sell PET bales or HDPE bales at good price, but if you're having green PET in them or shrink sleeves or these bad elements, it lowers the value. So it hurts the economics of both MRFs and plastic and aluminum recyclers. It reduces consumer confusion. This idea, there's some of these labels that actually tell consumers to cut off the shrink sleeve before recycling it. I've actually tried to do it. It's very difficult. I don't think I don't believe that it's actually allowed by the FTC, in my opinion, but I am not a lawyer or an FTC lawyer, to put that label on there and still call this bottle recyclable. And it's certainly not something a reasonable customer should have to do. Imagine having kids and a knife and, oh, what am I going to do with this bottle? I have to cut off this label before I put it in the recycle bin. No, there are standard kinds of labels that can be used. Next slide, please. And just to show you, actually the technical experts all agree that all of these three problems are real problems. NAPCOR, which is the industry association for the PET industry, they say shrink sleeves lower bale price and quality. They say plastic metal components are a problem, and they say non-clear PET lowers values. Association for Plastic Recycler identifies shrink sleeves as a top 5 problem. Plastic metal components increase cost, reduce quality, and they acknowledge that no color clear PET is preferred for widest use. The Walmart design guide for recycling actually says that these full shrink sleeve full shrink sleeves more than 85% are not allowed, even though they're still on products. They're not allowed the Snapple, or sorry, the metal and plastic cutoff lids. And also this Asterix material flow study, which it was sponsored by Recycling Partnership, and they really looked at all the issues that are in PET contamination, issues that are in MRFs and so on. And they identified shrink sleeves as a top concern. And they actually have a quote from a PET recycler that says, no one wants to buy anything but clear PET. So we looked at all the research from all the technical experts in the industry field, and they all cite these as problems as well. Next slide, please. So just a bit more detail, just to show that we've done real research into it. So the proposal would be that only clear PET bottles are employed for beverage bottles in California. And again, companies have been doing this in Japan since 2001. And next slide, please. And in fact, Coca-Cola is bragging about it, about how they're doing it in other places of the world. And they say the change from Sprite's iconic green color will make PET bottles far easier to recycle. So they're moving to this in other parts of the world, and they're proud of it. So one would imagine that they shouldn't have a problem with doing it in California as well. Another aspect to this actually that came up as a comment from Susan Collins at Container Recycling Institute was that now that there's going to be this PET requirement for mandated content in PET bottles, it's going to need to be clear to come back, right? So it's impossible to think you'd get a system where you'd get green or blue back and just put recycled content back into them. Really, to get enough clean PET back, it's better to meet the mandated requirements, is better to have clear PET. Next slide, please. And this is a marketing mechanism. And again, these little tops that have metal and plastic cause havoc in the PET processors. Next slide, please. And then shrink sleeves. And shrink sleeves, by and large, are being put on products now for marketing reasons. And I've just given some examples here of problem containers, and then containers that are used for exactly the same kind of products, sometimes the very same companies that aren't a problem. They're simple solutions to use other types of labels and approved labels that don't wreck recyclability. So there's standard labels that exist for all of this. A question that's come up is, would the recommendation be that we should just strictly follow the Association of Plastic Recyclers guidelines for what are acceptable shrink sleeves? And based on what I've heard from California PET processors, I would say no. I think we need to really have our own California law, because some of the approved labels actually take the installation of expensive new equipment or take a lot more wash water. So then rather than just citing another outside group's approved list, we should actually take a look and really poll the PET processors and recyclers within California to say which type of labels don't cause problems in your existing operations. Next slide, please.
Commissioner Dell, there's a few comments from the commissioners, starting with Commissioner
I'm almost
Ward.
done. I'm almost done, and then you can ask questions or make comments. Okay, so that's the shrink sleeves. Next, last slide, please. So this is it in summary. The current proposal is to require only clear PET, adopt a state policy that says only clear PET beverage bottles. The no combined metal, plastic, or components or lids. Within the committee, there was discussion of should we say, no, don't use them, or should we create a management method where if a product company uses it, they would have to call the beverage bottle a 7, and then it would get a different fee. So those are options of policy management. I'm advocating for just saying, no, let's not use it. I think it's most direct, but it is definitely, you see the other two ideas. We could adopt a state policy to allow CalRecycle to have the ability to determine should these be a 7 or should there be an interrupter fee, and manage it that way. And then on the labels, adopt a state policy to not allow manufacturers to use these shrink sleeve or non-compatible labels that wreck recycling. And with that, okay, happy to answer questions and take comments and ideas. Let's see, who gets to go first? Who was first? I've lost track of when I started.
I think
Ward is
Ward.
Okay.
Ward?
Yeah, I just think you did a great job on this, Commissioner Dell, and I would move that we adopt these policies and ask you to draft language for consideration at a future meeting. Specifically, item 1, I would go with the first bullet. I like the idea of a disruptor fee, but I think it's clear enough that this should just not be allowed. So I'd go with the first bullet on item 2, but recommend we develop policy language for a future meeting.
Great, thank you. So next, Commissioner Sky is next.
Lapis.
Oh,
hey,
please, someone else, because I've lost track of the asterisk.
Thank you for your work on this. I do think that design for recyclability is one of the key things we need to work on, and appreciate you taking it on. Mostly on the same page with a couple maybe things where I'm not sure I totally agree. One is, on the APR guidance. I think the APR members, as far as I know, are the plastics recyclers, and so if they say something's okay, I am inclined to believe them. They've never really had motivation to, accept things that they don't want. So I would just hate for us to have a completely different standard in California than is the rest of the country, unless there's a really good reason, and it seems like the APR guidance is a good starting point.
Well, if I may reply to that, that's what I started with too. And just to let you know, 2 of the major PET recyclers in California quit APR last year, Carbon Light and Verdeco. So they really don't actually represent California recyclers. And when we had Paul from Global Plastics in, and he gave a presentation, and then he talked about exactly these problems, he emphasized that that it would be better just to that he had unique circumstances, and definitely I've heard that some of the so APR isn't independent, right? There's commercial interests that help get their labels approved. And so I do think it should be more independent of what really works for California recyclers, even to the extent if we set up a network we could have a policy recommendation of a committee of actual PET recyclers who could say yes, no, that works in our state. Because the water issue is a big deal actually also too. There's some washable inks that are getting proposed, but we're a really water scarce state. So I think that it would be better if we really looked at how PET processors in California or plastics processors view the processing equipment needed to handle these things.
I will try to follow up with some of the PET reclaimers that you mentioned. If any of them are listening, can submit comments. I'm curious if they dropped out of APR because they didn't agree with this, or I mean, I just don't think we should be making the decision for them in terms of what they can and can't accept. And I'm always nervous when it seems like us, you know, our group of 17 people who are well-meaning, but not, you know, we're still 17 people who were chosen for a commission, make really sweeping changes. I think it's, I think it'll be taken more seriously by the legislature and other folks if it is citing an industry guidance. And so I want to make sure that there's good reason to move away from that. So maybe just to put a pin in that for now until we hear from the other PET folks. And then on the item that's on the page now, I agree that it should be that number one should be a policy that the legislature adopt. I don't want to rule out a variation of number two. And that's, I mean, we have the second bullet point is basically pass a law saying that they are number sevens. And I think that is also a good policy. There's another thing we talked about, which was having different processing fees for different categories of number ones. So not having a single number one processing fee, but having a number one clear processing fee and a number one colored processing fee, which is something I think we should leave in there because I think it is within the scope of CalRecycle existing authority. And I don't think it would require a change in law. So that would be a recommendation to CalRecycle. And that's the one thing that we talked about that I don't think was really reflected here. But other than that, everything else looks great. Oh, and actually one more point, sorry. On the shrink sleeves, I agree with the sentiment and with the concept. I think in the actual proposal, we need to make sure we leave room for, you know, things that are done for health and safety or, you know, stuff like that. But that comes down to wordsmithing the actual recommendation.
Are you recommending some changes to this, or what are you recommending? Because this is being proposed to us for actual adoption.
I don't think it is being proposed to us for adoption because it's not a written recommendation. And
right, but I mean, agreeing with the policy so that they can go back and write it up.
Yes, and I think, I mean, we've never really given anybody, we've never voted to ask somebody to write up a proposal. And I personally think that this is great, and I would love to see a variation of this adopted, but some parts of it need a little bit of work. And I would be glad to help.
Well, I think what I'm hearing, I mean, we need to take it back and put it into the text form, and after we got input to do this, but if I could just hit the nail on the head here. For both number one and number two, the question becomes, would the commission prefer to have a policy that we say, no, clear only, there's no market for green, there's no market or for brown, blue, and in fact, trying to separate them makes you lose some clear. And the same with the lids, or do we want to have some sort of disruptor fee? And that third bullet under the second one, I think, is what you're talking about, Nick. And I would like to have a discussion and input from the commission because I don't want to have to go back and write two different text options. I'm advocating that out is out. And if we really want to fix something and get real, we say, don't use it. It's not recyclable. It wrecks recyclability. There's no value. Doesn't hurt anybody. Everybody gets to still enjoy their beverages. You just can't use the bad thing. So I would actually, Heidi, like to have that feedback. Now, if the commission all says, no, we all want to have a disruptor fee and have CalRecycle implemented over 10 years and hope it works, then we'll go that way.
Okay, so I hear.
But I think we do this is a fork in the road that I would like the commission to decide on.
Okay, well then let's get some.
I don't think this is necessarily a fork in the road. I think that the two are not mutually exclusive. Yes, if you're talking about what the recommendation to the legislature is it a fee or a ban? That totally makes sense. But I think we have a recommendation to the legislature that I would be comfortable being either of those, but I think I prefer a ban. But separately, under the state bottle bill, we'd like to make a recommendation to CalRecycle on the processing fees and how they're assessed on different products. That doesn't require a change in statute. It's its existing law. It's how CalRecycle is implementing the bottle bill. And then again, the nice thing about that is that it does not require a bill to pass, and especially doesn't require a 2/3 vote bill, which a lot of fees would be.
So commissioners in the chat box that wanted to.
Okay.
Commissioner Medrano, did you want to say something?
Yeah, quickly. Thank you very much for the report. I like the similarities between the Ellen MacArthur report that was recently produced on recyclability design. At what point will we want to add recycled content on the containers or a requirement? Or are we keeping that out because of the future legislation or future item that Recology is bringing up?
Yeah, so this is designed for recyclability, and then requiring recycled content. Obviously, there's been one law passed. I view that as a parallel effort, but not part of this. So this sets it up on these items. It's really plastic bottles, jugs, and aluminum cans. There's some shrink sleeves going on aluminum cans. It just sets it up for being most recyclable, helping the system today. There's demand for clear PET and HDPE today, you know. There is a real demand. This isn't like, oh, let's go make a market. So let's get more of that, filling that demand. So to answer your question, I just see that as a parallel effort. If that's okay.
Thank you.
Commissioner Dunleavy?
Yes, Commissioner Dell, thank you again for all your hard work on this. I mean, this is just common sense. It's better packaging. We like the products that are inside, the lemon lime drinks, the hand lotions. Those are all great products. The packaging is what needs to be worked on. Going from green to clear, it's going to help the MRFs. It's going to help the recycling centers. It's going to help the reclaimers. It's going to help achieve AB 793. So I think that one's pretty easy to do. With the shrink sleeves, the labeling, I mean, we're talking fractions of a penny that they're putting on the labels. But when they put on these incompatible labels, it really harms the recyclability of it. And I think there are labels out there, as we've seen, they could put on that are compatible to the recycling process. So I think all three of these are achievable. Number two was going to get CalRecycle involved. And in past discussions with the Assistant Deputy Director, as far as reclassifying containers to another processing payment, my understanding from CalRecycle is if a container is predominantly PET, they're limited to that processing payment. They couldn't convert it to a number 7 or another item. Same thing with an aluminum can. Even though it might have had a plastic lid or a plastic label, they could not reclassify it. It might be worth another discussion with Deputy Director Keeney at this point, but gets them involved with it. With this, if Commissioner Ward had a motion, I would happily second it, that Commissioner Dell, we write this up into the policy format that's been presented to the commission and then bring it back to the commission level rather than further discussion at the recycling committee. I think it's up here. I think we can keep it up here for the sake of time. So Commissioner Ward, if that was a motion to move, I happily second it.
There's still other commissioners that have thoughts, so I thought we should take them all before we make. If that's okay.
Sorry,
Commissioner Toyota. I'm caught. Thank you. I'm caught up on the asterisk. Commissioner Toyota.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I really like this, and I really appreciate all the work that went into it. Just a couple of comments. you know, overall in general, bans, they don't necessarily create a change to packaging for recycling. It doesn't automatically do that. So, you know, when you specifically for number one, say moving from green to a clear bottle, then that takes care of it. Removing shrink sleeve labels most likely will, but it doesn't necessarily do that. You know, bans don't automatically create packaging or an incentive to package for recycling. So that's one of my kind of a little bit of an issue here. The other thing is we're getting really kind of specific on very specific items, which is great because I mean really they do need to be moved out of the system and quickly. But legislation, you know, it's hard to get passed and then it's very hard to change. And so I kind of agree that maybe this doesn't have to be a crossroads and maybe you can still add something in there when you write this out that you can do all this, but also add a disruptor fee for something that comes out later so that we're not just, we don't have to create a whole nother law and go through a whole nother process for the next issue that comes through. I'd really like to see if there's some way that it can be, they can do all of these things and then possibly create a disruptor fee for anything else, or, you know, I can help work wording on that, whatever, but I don't necessarily want to take that out at this point, or at least bring those points in somewhere else so that, again, we're not so specific that we just have to take every single thing back up to the legislation.
Yeah, and that's a really great point. And I know we're making recommendations to the CRV system, so maybe that's a place to put it in parallel, right? Commissioner Dunleavy, I don't know if you have time to talk about those recommendations. And that's fine for beverages, but actually most, if you remember the previous slide for the shrink sleeves, actually the good news is there's not that many bad shrink sleeves on PET bottles. Those are mostly have been taken off. That's the good news. I'm going to take, I won't say what it is, but I did get one company to take them off. But it's mostly not beverage. It's HDPE of coffee stuff. It's not CRV. So there's not a fee mechanism set up, right? So there would be no way to put a disruptor fee on shrink sleeves on this mayonnaise, for example. There's no, I don't think we could create one, right? But point taken on the CRV and improving the CRV, that maybe there can be a mechanism around design recyclability and an disruptor fee in general around that. Commissioner Dunleavy, is that something we can include in the discussion of improving the CRV system?
Yep.
Sorry about that. Yes, Commissioner Dell, we could add that to our discussion this Friday or on the 13th and how we can incorporate that.
Great. Okay, Commissioner Sky.
Thank you. It seems like we're moving towards consensus, and it sounds like the consensus is that one, there's products out there that are bad for recycling and serve no other purpose besides marketing, that we should recommend as our policy that those be prohibited. And then the other consensus seems like when there's mechanisms to implement some improvements, whether it's a disruptor fee or some other kind of fee through existing legislation, we recommend that directly to CalRecycle or the other agencies that can implement that. But I like the idea, and I think this is where Commissioner Toyota was going, to recommend an umbrella legislation so that we don't have to keep passing legislation for policies that are very specific. And maybe that's something that the second bullet in number 2 can be amended to essentially provide CalRecycle the authority to implement some kind of incentives or disincentives for problematic products. And if it's written more broadly when the legislation is adopted, then it gives them a little bit more flexibility and they don't have to keep going back. So I don't know, Commissioner Toyota, is that something that would encapsulate your comments?
Yes, that's actually, thank you very much for articulating that.
Yeah, that was well articulated. And I get it, I think, on CRV, but not on everything else. Because right now, CalRecycle is not a product review entity, right? They're not their agency where they, companies have to show CalRecycle. Do they have to on CRV? Do companies have to say, hey, here's our product on CRV, we get a disruptor fee? Is there a mechanism right now? Someone help me. Commissioner Dunleavy?
I'll just jump in. I'll just jump in. There's no review process. If the beverage is in the program, it has to be properly labeled, and then the distributors have to collect the appropriate CRV and beverage manufacturer processing payment and forward that on to CalRecycle. And then CalRecycle, they do audits from time to time to look at containers that are out on the shelves to make sure they are in the program. But that's something that the audit process has been limited. But there's no product or design review before it actually hits the shelf. So a lot of times recyclers will forward items on. Like right now, we're seeing a lot of CBD drinks hitting the shelf that are labeled CRV or not labeled CRV, but they're in the program, and then CalRecycle goes to the producers on those.
So right now, then, a company gets to decide to put a 7 on it or not, based on type of material? No?
Yes.
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 Nick's saying no.
No, they don't. They don't have to get it pre-approved, but there are specific requirements for CRV.
So taking this idea of this umbrella look at for beverage containers, it could potentially be worked through the CRV in maybe a more robust way, right? So that it's labeled a 7, because the 7s get higher disruptor fees, correct? So maybe we can work to strengthen that, right? Okay. But then I pose the question back to Commissioner Toyota and Commissioner Sky for all of the non-beverage. All in the previous slide, there's so many containers of detergents and all these things, tons of containers. CalRecycle's not an entity, is not a product review entity. They're just not set up to be that. I don't know. It's probably not in their charter to do that. So would an umbrella, so what are you thinking there?
Just to clarify, my suggestion was to make that essentially a 4th recommendation, that to the legislature to adopt legislation that would give that authority to CalRecycle so that they could regulate all those other products.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. That's interesting. So may I break that one off and keep these 3 around design for recyclability because they're kind of specific, and give some thought to that 4th one around what that might look like? Is that okay? Yes.
Okay, this is Heidi. I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. So you're suggesting a 4th recommendation that gives CalRecycle, we ask for legislation that gives CalRecycle the authority to vet the materials getting onto the market, basically.
Exactly.
Which is what we've discussed. So there's 2 ways that this can happen. One is that, or the other is producer performance standards and like producer responsibility that they have to achieve X, Y, and Z to just operate. So just putting it out there, those are 2 different ways to get at the same thing. And I think we're running out of time. We're at 5 after, but this is very important discussion.
And Commissioner Schneider was next, and then there's a public comment.
I like everything that you've done, but I'm putting my reuse hat on. you're designing for recyclability, not designing for reuse and refillables. So does that mean that that component then goes under source reduction, where it's standing alone and not being considered for any bottle bill changes or other changes? Part of the problem with reuse in its various forms is it's always an afterthought, and it actually needs to be at the front end. And that's just a simple way of making sure that reuse is considered in the design. Over time, we have allowed glass to be substituted for plastic. And this recommendation, which I agree with, is still going to continue that trend.
I completely agree with you. I think, and I know I've gotten public comments from stakeholders. Why aren't you talking more about reusables and refillables and all of that? And I know you've raised your hand, and now you'll have more times. Congratulations on your election to move forward with that. And that needs to be emphasized in the report, because that's reduction, right, of all packaging. So I think this is a critical issue you bring up, and one that needs to be addressed. But I think this stands alone, just looking at this one aspect of how can we immediately reduce waste to landfills, improve recyclability. This is a standalone thing, if that's okay.
I agree with that. I just have to point that out for all of us. We've got to put it at the front end of anything that we're doing, or it will never happen. My other concern is, if we, on the Market Development Committee, we talked about standardization of bottle types, like what Canada has done for beer bottles. If California goes that direction, the labels become a bigger issue. So I'm really interested to hear about labeling and what can make something reusable, as opposed to not just hindering the recycling of it. So just throwing that out there as the recycling committee goes forward.
Okay, and we have a public comment?
Yes. We have one public comment. It's from Bruce Magnani from Association of Plastics Recyclers, APR. He says, APR does represent California recyclers and reclaimers. One member is one of the largest PET reclaimers in the world. Commissioner Adele, who I believe is an engineer, would be welcome to speak with APR directly, so she has a true understanding of the comprehensively developed design guide. APR consulted with some of the most knowledgeable experts in the recycling industry in the world. That is the comment.
Well, I'd enjoy the conversation. I've actually paid my own way to 2 of your conferences and attended and read the design guidelines in great detail. And it's actually where I met Paul from Global Plastics on the floor of the APR conference 2 years ago, who complained to me about all of these things that are entering his processing facility. So with that,
Commissioner Dell, I'm sorry to interrupt you again. Another one just came through from APR that I can read to you. It just says, APR works closely with its members who actively provide feedback and examples of problematic containers. APR will then notify brand owners and manufacturers that their packaging is detrimental to recycling. This activity is incorporated into the comprehensive APR design guide.
Right. And so actually, in a more detailed presentation, I actually went through the design guide and pulled out some of the examples. And I think the design guide says that the extent of the shrink sleeves, like on the HDPE labels, can only be 75%, and they're all full body, all the examples that we gave. So actually, most of these examples that we gave on these shrink sleeves, and they all have these labels that you have to cut them off, don't pass the APR guideline. I do think that when we specifically look at the shrink sleeves, which is the biggest issue here, we should go very carefully through what is in the APR design guideline, and then talk to California Plastics Recycler and see if it comes out to 1 or 2 things that they say, no, that would take a lot more wash water, or no, we'd have to spend another $1 million of equipment in order to answer that. And there may just be 1 or 2 things. But going back to the 2 previous ones on clear bottles and the lid components, we cited from the APR information at the top that said that those were problematic. So with that, we had a motion and a second. Chair Sanborn, would you like to call for a motion to approve taking this back now and writing it into a text report or a text proposal to then bring back to the commission for the next review?
Yeah, I'd like to be very clear on what that motion is in just a moment, but I did want to bring up that we have received prior comments that some of these shrink sleeves are actually on there for health and safety reasons. And I think we have to acknowledge that we've heard those comments, that there are other purposes just than marketing for those shrink sleeves. Although I, totally agree with these general recommendations. I just wanted to make sure people didn't think that we didn't hear that. So I think it was Commissioner Ward who made the original motion. Do you want to make it again just to make sure everybody's 100% clear, because we ended up adding a fourth thing?
Sure. So I moved that we asked the Marketing and Media Committee to develop these into policy language at a future meeting and incorporation into the document, specifically items 1, 2, and 3, and the first bullet on 1. And I think the discussion followed that the disruptor fee would be taken up by the recycling committee as part of the comments on the bottle bill, and then also making space for Commissioner Sky's recommendation for item 4.
Which was that the producers, that CalRecycle be given the authority to actually screen materials, correct?
Yeah, and while I generally agree with that direction, I think I also want to point out that I think politically it's a very, very difficult ask for CalRecycle as their bureaucrats, and I mean that in a very respectful tone, because they're the bureau responsible for implementing these policies, but they can't pick enemies. And so you can't, it's very hard to ask them to say, all right, you're going to identify this product as a problem. You really need to give them something like the 3-part test like you had before. You say either it meets the criteria or it doesn't, but they really need that guidance. Without it, I think it's not a workable.
As a friendly amendment, that was actually, I was waiting to see if somebody was going to say it, but that was my suggestion as well, because I think I don't see how they would have the ability to vet this stuff. But I think if we have a standard and a test that they can check the box whether those things have been met, that they could do. So maybe that's a friendly amendment if you wish to accept it.
I think we're actually on the same page. So to the extent you understood my motion, that was it.
Yeah, that's actually why I wanted to break that one off. It's a tougher lift. And these are just 3 straightforward things. And I love the idea of the umbrella and what that might look like. But as I try to visualize it out, and these are all on the recycling committee, by the way, to say what that might begin to look like, I think is a harder lift and longer term. So agreed it should go forward. And just because it's hard, we shouldn't put it on. But these are just 3 more straightforward ones that hopefully we can push forward.
Okay, so the motion.
But I think on the motion too, though, didn't Commissioner Lapis ask that we double check the information that we put here in terms of what the agency was saying was, the AP, whatever. I mean, it's, that we check that. That should be part of the motion. Because I think that's important. I mean, Nick makes a very important comment in terms of if these policies are to be taken up by the legislature, they have to have been vetted and that everyone's opinion has been heard. And I think he makes a very important comment regarding that.
I totally agree with that, but I think Commissioner Dell heard that. I would anticipate it being incorporated.
So we have a first and a second on a motion that's basically on 4 things. The 4th is not on this slide. And I would suggest that we just vote on the 4, but give the authority to Commissioner Dell and the recycling committee to flesh out that 4th one, maybe working with Commissioner Sky, who had brought that up. And if everybody's okay with that, then that can get written and come back. There's plenty of time for everybody to vet it and take more bites at the apple. Is everybody okay with that direction? Or not?
Chair Sanborn, no, for the sake of time, we've already posted the agendas for Friday's meeting and November 13th's meeting. So to run this back to the recycling committee and then bring it back to the commission level, I think we're looking at January, possibly. So I think Commissioner Ward was looking at his motion having Commissioner Dell write all this up in policy discussion and bring it back at the commission level. So instead of sending it back down and then coming back up, I think we can just do it at the next or 2 meetings from now at the commission level.
That's fine. I think the only difference being that I was thinking that whatever disruptor fee language would come from the recycling committee and then bring forward, that would not be part of these. That way we're clear about what goes to what Commissioner Dell is going to work on and what the recycling commission is.
But number 2 has the disruptor fee mentioned in it, and we were adopting these.
Okay, I was advocating bullet 1, where we simply ban it, and that the disruptor fee issue be addressed by the recycling committee
Yes.
and brought forward.
Okay.
I mean, I think the disruptor fee is slightly different from the conversation about the processing fees. They're both important, but they're slightly different. The processing fees really do fit into design for recyclability, and I'd like to work with Jan and see if we can get it all as one cohesive narrative. Because I actually think it's not contradictory at all. I'm just having a hard time explaining it.
Okay, I just want to make sure everybody's clear what we're doing. So we're adopting these 3 items on the screen, plus the 4th, but the 4th has to be drafted with Commissioner Sky and Commissioner Dell on allowing CalRecycle some sort of vetting or a checklist for product design.
Just for clarification, I think may I suggest Commissioner Dell and Lapis work on the language for the 3 that we're seeing here, and I work with Commissioner Ward on that 4th item.
It'll come back then written policy for this commission to take up. So that means this should be on the next agendized, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and then that would be our first official reading to put it into the report. Okay, very good. Then if everybody's okay with that direction, if everybody's clear, if you have any questions, please ask them now. I want to make sure everybody's clear on what we're doing. We can get a thumbs up and that we will make room on the next agenda for this to be adopted. Commissioner Bouchard, you okay with that? Kadena? Yeah? Okay, good. All right, nobody's opposed? Really good work again. Thank you again. Commissioners Dell and Dunleavy, that's really good work and it's moving. But again, I expect we're going to hear some more comments, especially about the shrink sleeves, because I know they keep bringing that up. So we'll move on and make sure that we I'm just making a note that this is going to be an item probably requiring quite a bit of discussion on the next agenda when the language comes back. Because we are running out of time. As you can see, this is why our meetings are so precious, our time, because we're already 12 minutes away from the end of the meeting and we've covered 2 of 4 committees. So I'm gonna, is there anything else, Commissioner Dunleavy, on the Recycling Committee?
Yeah, I'll be quick and won't go into the discussion on this, but just ask for time at the start of the next meeting. We will bring policy recommendations back to the commission related to making the grocers whole so they can be a stronger part of the program. Right now, they don't get paid CRV or handling fees, so we'll recommend that. And then clarification on store exemptions. Right now, it's 35% of the stores can be exempt from in-store take-back. I think we'd like to clarify that to 35% of the stores by county or jurisdiction. And the freshest example of that right now is up in Humboldt, where I think all 16 stores have filed exemptions, and there's only 1 gas station that is a dealer take back, and they've lost all their recycling centers. So it's allowed that all those stores filed an exemption, but now that jurisdiction is without a real viable recycling center. So we'll bring some language to clarify the store exemptions from 35% to 35% by county or jurisdiction.
Okay. Well, the only thing, oh, you got more.
Go ahead on that.
Oh, I was just going to suggest that this item alone that's coming back to the next committee could take quite a bit of time, and we haven't even heard from the other committees yet with other policies. So we may get to the place where we have to start prioritizing, but we'll do that together in just a moment.
Okay. And then we'll also bring a policy recommendation basically to support CalRecycle's AB 54 report addressing convenience zones, and then allowing handling fee payments to recycling centers that are not on dealer sites. Right now, they must be on a dealer site, but these are concepts that are in the CalRecycle AB 54 report. So I think we would just be making the recommendation to support that report with policy, but then also adding establishing caps on handling fees by recycling center or by jurisdiction, because there's some recycling centers that are getting handling fees in excess of $20,000 per month. And then some zones that are very highly served with a lot of convenience zones, and they're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in handling fees. So to take the burden off of the fund, limiting the handling fees by recycling center and jurisdiction. So we'll come back with that language. Then next slide. Some areas that we have not been able to come to a consensus on, but how we deal with payments for overserved and underserved areas based on density. This is an item that was addressed in the AB 54 report, but we can't make this recommendation until we get some information from CalRecycle. If you could go to the next slide. And then the same thing goes with increased deposits or adding wine and spirits, because the finances on these two items are huge. Within the bottle bill, people pay a sales tax on deposits. So right now, the Beverage Container Fund is taking in approximately $1.3 to $1.4 billion a year. But then that money, consumers are paying a sales tax. So it's generating in excess of $100 million a year in sales tax dollars that go to the general fund. So we've asked CalRecycle for some data before we consider making a recommendation on increasing the deposits or wine and spirits, just because the dollars are so huge with these two items. So we'll have to wait for CalRecycle's information. And then, as I mentioned, we have a meeting this coming Friday, and then one scheduled for the 13th. And then we will schedule some follow-up meetings going into December. So that's it for me.
Okay. Thank you. And Commissioner Schneider? You had a comment? Commissioner Schneider?
Sorry.
You're muted, Ann.
Commissioner Donlevy, your last slide where you're talking about adding spirits, can you, when you're looking at that, please consider reuse, refillables?
Okay.
And the effect of commingling that has hurt any existing refillables. And I understand that refillables and curbside don't go together well. So you're going to go into, it's going to be a drop off or buyback, I would think.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to make a suggestion, because I think the resource reduction and refilling was kind of delegated to you and Commissioner Ward. And maybe when it comes to specific recommendations coming from different committees on items that refilling and reuse might be a good option, that you coordinate there and make sure that there's some, discussion about that. Maybe get invited to that committee to discuss those options or something.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, sure. And I do want to say that I've talked to CalRecycle, and they say that they can't really provide the data on wine and spirits because they don't do wine and spirits now. They don't have that data. And I'm worried if we want to make a recommendation on increasing the deposit of wine and spirits, I'm not sure we're ever going to get the data that has been requested in advance of our making a decision. And I'm not sure we have to have it. I just wanted to throw that out there. Zoe, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so we've met internally, and we'll have an update for the commission and the committee as to what we can provide very, very shortly. We're taking a look and just seeing, what is available. So, to your point, Heidi, this isn't data that the department collects, but I think there is some information that we'll be able to provide that'll be helpful in responsive to what Jeff and the recycling committee would like us to provide.
That's great. Thank you. And we're already only 5 minutes away. And because we're only noticed until 12:30 and actually 4 minutes away now, we literally can't go over or they turn the whole Zoom thing off. So unfortunately, we were not even able to get to the labeling or the market development committees. So I would encourage those committees to continue your work and see if you have more time, you can get more work done and be ready, because we'll put maybe labeling, however you want to do it, Commissioner Dell and Mr. Davis, one or the other will be first at the next meeting, and then we can go backwards and take up, organics or recycling and organics. So you can see where we're getting very jammed on time to have these policy discussions and getting them into the January 1 report. And I think all those watching who ask questions about this, you are seeing the report be written live. Those are our priorities, and you can see from what we're doing what will be most likely into the January 1st report, because we have 2 readings. So there's not going to be any surprises on what is in this report or giving you enough time to comment. So I want to make sure everybody's clear on that. With that, I'm going to move it on to our next agenda item, which is future meetings. So we've got number 8. So on the 18th of November, we're going to have an open discussion. We've got Assemblymember Eggman coming for half an hour. She will be from 9:30 to 10. We will have her at the next meeting. So if you have questions for Assemblymember Eggman, please let us know, or just go ahead and bring them to the committee or commission meeting. We have December 16th. Kelly Pay Secretary Blumenfeld will be back from 9 to 9:30. He's looking forward to talking with us again. And that's all and then for future agenda items for the next meeting, I have that we're going to put at least an hour on the final ban recommendations. And so we'll take that up again, and hopefully everybody agrees with that. And the chair and I will bring back something about a battery proposal, some ideas on how to handle that battery issue since we're seeing the fires. We'll bring back this recycling proposal. We'll hopefully have language from the recycling committee on that, and maybe some some changes to some of the other ban language and market or organics language that got pulled out from what is going into the report today. Is there anything I missed for the next meeting? Okay, I don't see any comments. Then with that, I would say that we are done, and really congratulations to everybody. We're doing amazing work for a volunteer commission and getting a lot done. The report is being built live. Ted and I will keep working on that. And thank you all very much for your hard work. And if there's anything else you wish to bring up now, we've got about a minute left.
One quick comment, if I might. And that's with respect to the recycling committee. I very much appreciate the list that you produced, but specifically I'm concerned about number 3, number 4, number 5, and number 6 bottles, and number 7 bottles, and note that they're all required to be included to receive CRV certification. That might be part of the reason why they're above the 80%. And if they're not actually being recycled, let me just state clearly that's still a concern, even though they're meeting the criteria. So I think we need to drill down a little bit further on that. And just because they're meeting the criteria and they seem to be recycled now, I really think we need the information to confirm that those materials are actually being recycled in order for them to stay on the recommended.
They're not, but they're not on the list. They're not on the top 15 list. And also the clarification was MRFs don't have to take them back legally. That was a misunderstanding in the industry, and we got an answer from Cal Recycle. So any MRF listening, you don't have to take 3 through 7s in order to get your CRV funds. But actually, Commissioner Ward, they're not on the recommended list, 3 through 7s.
I just saw it on the path.
We're at time, unfortunately. Yeah, unfortunately, we're at time. They're going to cut us off. So thank you. We could talk all day, even with 4 hours. We don't have enough time. So thank you all very much. Let's hope the country heals and can come back together after this election. And congratulations, you've gotten an awful lot of work done. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.